Valerie Knox roared in the middle of the ring, her eyes blazing. "This is a fight arena, not a place for black trash to chase dreams." A police officer shouted with contempt, "Drag that little girl up. Let's see how long she lasts against the champion of America." The auditorium erupted in laughter. Hundreds of phones raised high, all waiting for a public humiliation. Nyah Campbell was shoved forward, her oversized gloves hitting the floor. The crowd booed. "Get up, you coward." Valerie smirked, slamming her gloves together like thunder. "I'm going to crush you in front of the whole world. Let's begin, poor little girl." The pounding of drums echoed through the arena. Spotlights flashing from dozens of angles lit the ring like the center of the universe. Every seat was packed. The crowd screamed the name of the female fighter. Some waved signs, others held flags, all of them burning with anticipation for a display of raw power. Amid the chaos, Valerie Knox appeared like a blaze of red fire. Her steps were heavy and firm, arms bulging, chest held high, eyes flashing with the smugness of someone who had never tasted defeat. Each time she raised her fist to salute the crowd, a wave of thunderous applause followed, people shouting until their voices cracked. Valerie wore a crooked smile, half taunt, half defiant, a reminder to everyone that here, power belonged to her. Below the stands, a group of police officers stood guard, though in truth they blended into the excited mass. One of them, tall and broad, suddenly shouted, breaking the rhythm of the cheers, "Give her a different challenge! Drag that Jamaican girl up here, just for fun!" His voice echoed, pulling hundreds of eyes toward him. Laughter erupted instantly, as if the crowd had been given permission for cruelty. A few whistled, some jumped to their feet, stomping and shouting, eager to witness a sick joke unfold. Valerie heard it. Her eyes lit up with amusement. She turned to the audience, smirked, and shrugged as if to say she approved of the wicked idea. In the middle of the crowd, Nyah Campbell was shoved forward. Her small body stumbled, both hands clinging to the hem of her worn shirt like it was her last anchor. The lights from the arena ceiling beamed down, washing youthful faces pale. Her wide, dark eyes shimmered with tears as she scanned the space in panic, searching for one sympathetic gaze, one hand to save her. But all she met were the fake, bloodthirsty faces of hundreds shouting Valerie's name. Another officer grabbed Nyah's thin arm, yanked her upright, and tossed her toward the ring. The cruel laughter rose again. Thunderous clapping erupted as if a new form of entertainment had just begun. Valerie waited, casually rotating her glove, eyes fixed on the girl like blades. "Don't shake," she growled loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I'll go easy on you, as long as you know how to bow." Her words set off another explosion from the stand, a storm of boos, whistles, and stomping feet, all blending into a flood of humiliation that swallowed the arena whole. Nyah stood frozen in the center of the ring, her small hands gripping a pair of oversized boxing gloves someone had shoved onto her. The gloves were so big they slipped from her wrists, but she didn't dare complain, didn't dare refuse. Her lips trembled, her throat tightened, and she could only whisper something so faint no one heard it. "I don't want to." But her words vanished beneath a tide of cruel laughter. A few people in the front row leaned in and shouted at her face, "Get up, you coward! You're about to be famous, kid." The laughter roared again, a sound stripped of all humanity. Valerie took a deep breath, shoulders rising, then stepped closer, making Nyah recoil without thinking. She leaned in, her voice carrying through the referee's mic. "Little piece of trash, I'm going to make you kneel in front of everyone, and you'll remember me for the rest of your life." The crowd exploded like a wildfire, screaming and filming, everyone hungry to witness what they were certain would be a delicious moment of humiliation. The referee looked at them all with a dead stare, then waved his hand and declared the fight had begun, treating this forced match like a legitimate show. In that moment, Nyah Campbell felt the floor beneath her turn slick, as if it were trying to swallow her tiny frame. The air was thick, pressing in on her lungs, while jeering laughter closed in like 1,000 blades. She shut her eyes, hands trembling as they clenched the gloves tighter, her chest pounding with wild, tangled rhythm, half fear, half fury. When she opened them, Valerie was still there, a giant wall ready to crush. Amid the sea of people howling for disgrace, a thin thread of silence suddenly flickered inside Nyah, and in that quiet, she heard her mother's voice rising from a distant memory. "You're not allowed to bow your head." No one in the arena knew that at that very moment, in the trembling eyes of the little girl, a different kind of light had begun to flicker. A light that signaled tonight would not go the way the arrogant had hoped. Valerie stood upright, chin lifted high as if the entire arena were her personal stage, the lights casting a proud gleam across her face. She leaned slightly toward Nyah, her wide hand tapping rhythmically against her glove, eyes glinting with mockery. "Don't shake, kid," Valerie whispered, loud enough for the audience to catch every word. "I'll go easy, as long as you take your humiliation like a good girl. Laughter exploded behind her, echoing like hundreds of taunted beasts. Every eye locked onto the small, timid girl in the ring, turning Nyah into prey surrounded on all sides. A police officer in the front row jerked his chin toward Valerie, his laugh booming like thunder. That's it, show her some blood. Let them see that a joke's worth more than a sermon. The people around him clapped. Someone raised a beer bottle and shouted, turning the scene into a festival of mockery. Valerie looked back at the crowd, raised her fist high to collect the roar of approval, then slowly turned to face Nyah again, that half smile never leaving her face. Nyah didn't move. The oversized gloves weighed down her arms, and cold sweat poured across her forehead. Her tiny hands tried to grip tighter, but every movement was clumsy, as if the gloves belonged to someone else. Her throat was dry, lips trembling as she muttered a few broken words. I don't want. The voice was so faint it vanished in the chaos. No one cared about the plea. All they waited for was Valerie's first strike. A voice from the crowd cut through the noise. Stand up, coward! You're sharing the ring with the queen. The room erupted again, each wave of cruelty slamming against Nyah's ears. The referee stepped in, eyes cold as steel, no hesitation in his stance. He looked at Valerie, then at the grinning officers, and raised his hand. The match begins. A crisp flick of his wrist, as if this ceremony were lawful and deserved no compassion. The bell rang out, pouring more cruelty into an already suffocating air. Valerie stepped forward, each movement making the floor tremble, pressing Nyah deeper into fear. She lowered her voice, just enough for the mic around the referee's neck to catch it all. Lift your head, little girl. I want to see the look in your eyes before you fall. Her words sliced like a blade, sending the crowd into a frenzy of delight. They laughed, they shouted, they thirsted for blood, and in the center of it all stood a trembling girl, like a leaf in a storm. Nyah backed away without thinking, her spine hitting the ropes, breath quick and shallow. In that instant, a memory flickered. Her small room in Kingston, her mother holding her sister's hand and saying, "Wherever you are, you keep your back straight." It passed quickly, but left a trace like a spark in the dark. Nyah's eyes filled with tears, but that spark flashed, faint and sudden, as if trying to rise against the tide of faces hungry to see her broken. Valerie raised her gloves and swung through the air, the sound slicing sharply as the crowd roared in frenzy. A police officer leaned in and shouted into the loudspeaker, "Valerie, take her down. It's just for laughs." The arena shook with excitement. Every eye locked onto the Jamaican girl, so small it seemed a single hit could crush her. Nyah felt her body sink into the floor, legs trembling, heart pounding like a war drum. But still, she lifted her gaze and looked straight ahead. "You don't get a choice, you little brat," Valerie hissed through clenched teeth, stepping closer. The crowd's cruel laughter and the officers' shouts pressed in like a wall, closing in on Nyah. She took half a step forward, hesitating, arms lifting out of instinct, not to fight, but to shield herself. In her eyes, fear and pride clashed silently. The audience didn't notice, but Valerie did, and she laughed louder, sensing a more entertaining show was about to unfold. The referee stood in the corner, arms crossed, completely indifferent, as if everything was within the rules. The crowd screamed non-stop, and chants of "Valerie, finish her," echoed again and again. No one noticed that in one brief moment, Nyah took a deep breath, her bony shoulders rising, then exhaled slowly, eyes closing for a second, bracing for the storm about to strike. The trembling remained, but beneath the fear, a thin wire of resilience pulled tight, something primal and unexpected even to her. Valerie laughed, circling like a lioness around her prey, eyes taunting, her voice cutting through the space. "The whole world's gonna see what a coward you are." Whistles blared back. The crowd stomped their feet, boots pounding the wooden floor, shaking the air. Nyah stood still, her soles burning, the gloves on her hands heavy as lead, but the flicker in her eyes didn't die. And just as Valerie raised her arm high, ready to strike, the entire arena held its breath, waiting for the blood they all craved. The forced match didn't begin with fairness, but with every ounce of cruelty and shame a crowd could throw at a little girl. Yet in that very moment, a story began to take shape, quietly, one no one expected would ignite a different kind of fire. A storm no officer, no fighter, not even 1,000 screaming fans could ever contain. Valerie circled the ring, her tall frame sweeping around like a predator on the hunt. Her gloved hand smacked hard against the other palm, cracking through the air already thick with tension. She raised her fist, spun once in front of Nyah, her face lit with a sneer. "You know what you look like? A worn-out doll. Something I can pull the strings on whenever I want." Her voice shot outward, reaching thousands of screaming spectators. Laughter roared back, and the arena shook like an earthquake. Someone shouted while filming, "Now this is worth every penny." Cameras from all directions locked in, flashlights bursting non-stop, every frame capturing a moment of pure humiliation as a child was turned into public amusement. The crowd looked like a bloodthirsty flood. No one could tell freestyle sport from shame anymore. It all blurred into one brutal thrill. Sharp whistles pierced the air. Someone stood on a chair, waving a shirt like they were cheering for a circus act. Even young women laughed. Phones raised, live streaming as comments flooded social media. Each word a blade slicing into Nyah's dignity. The kids shaking like a fish out of water, hilarious. This is real American entertainment. Valerie's gonna crush her. In the police seating row, dark blue uniforms glinted under the lights. A heavy man with a shiny badge clapped loudly, his voice booming like a command. "Hit her, Valerie! Show her what her place is." That line sparked the crowd, who erupted with howls of laughter, fists pounding armrests, feet stomping wood, turning the arena into a massive cauldron of heat. Valerie stretched, flashed a smug grin, and bowed slightly toward the officer like someone thanking a patron for the perfect chance to display power. Nyah backed away, each tiny step pressed closer to the ropes. The cord dug into her back like a wound, pulling her into reality. There was nowhere left to go. She looked up, wide black eyes shining with tears, but not a single drop fell. Her breath quickened, fists clenched inside the gloves, her lip bitten so hard it bled. She couldn't cry in front of them, couldn't give them that satisfaction. The tears hovered, catching the light, then faded into a defiant, shaky stare that refused to break. Valerie stepped closer, fist raised again, her shadow stretching across Nyah's body under the lights. Her cold voice rang out, "Why don't you cry, little girl? I want to hear the scream. So does this crowd. Go ahead and cry. Someone will capture it and remind you forever." She laughed, sharp and piercing, then circled Nyah once more, like a snake coiling tight before the squeeze. The crowd exploded again, cheers hitting the ceiling. Someone even held up cash like a bet. "How long until she drops? 5 seconds? 10? A young man shouted, "I bet she's down after the first punch." Laughter erupted, pounding Nyah's ears like thunder. Those images crawled into her mind, every word like a needle stabbing her pride, forcing her deeper into a shadowed corner. Nyah pressed her back tightly against the ropes, her body trembling as if about to collapse. Yet in her bright eyes, a tiny flame refused to go out. She whispered inside her chest, soundless, lips barely moving, "Mama, I won't let them see me fall." Every quick breath merged with the pounding of her heart, not just fear, but the first roots of defiance. Valerie raised her arm, aimed her fist at Nyah, gloves clapped together with a sharp crack. "Ready, little girl?" she asked, but didn't wait for an answer. She just smirked, tilting her head so the crowd could clearly see her victorious face. The audience roared. A few officers whistled, and laughter drowned everything. Valerie leaned sideways, spun once more, then stepped in, her shadow swallowing Nyah whole. In that moment, the tension snapped tight, like a drawn string. Everyone in the arena felt a chill ripple down their spine, not from fear, but from a cruel thrill. Valerie spread her arms wide, mouth open in a full grin, eyes gleaming. The audience clapped in unison, screamed her name. Those shouts cracked like whips across Nyah's small body, but she kept her head up, eyes full of tears that refused to fall. That alone, however small, made Valerie pause for half a second. In that instant, amid the cruel laughter, the girl proved she wasn't a puppet to be played with. No one in the arena noticed the shift, still lost in their pleasure, but in Valerie's eyes, a thin flicker of doubt sparked, and Nyah, though still trembling, tightened her grip on the gloves, bracing for something none of them saw coming. Valerie stopped circling when her eyes locked onto Nyah's trembling gaze. The spotlight lit the girl's small face, sweat tracing down her thin cheeks. Valerie smirked, her arrogant smile sharp and clear. Then, without warning, she struck. The punch came fast and hard, like a hammer slamming into Nyah's fragile shoulder. The dry smack of glove against flesh echoed across the arena, heavy and brutal, shaking the wooden floor beneath. It wasn't gentle like Valerie had pretended. It was a real hit, full of force from a trained fighter, thrown not to knock out, but to humiliate. Nyah's body was so small that the impact alone knocked her forward. Her thin frame lost balance, crashing down, knees slamming into the floor with a thud that cut into anyone who still had a shred of conscience. The arena erupted instantly, a riot of screams, applause, and whistles. Some laughed wildly, stomping in rhythm with the shame, and others raised phones high to capture every second of the girl going down. A young woman in the front row laughed uncontrollably and yelled, "She's just a kid, Valerie! Give her more!" A man from across the room added, "Yeah, finish her quick. This match is pure fun." Laughter rolled over laughter. Shouts swelled like waves. The arena now a pit of bloodlust. In the police section, the face of the man who had ordered Nyah into the ring lit up, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction, his mouth curled into a cruel grin. He waved his hand, voice booming with fake authority. "She's still standing, keep going, don't stop." That shout, like a command, made the other officers burst out laughing, their cold amusement drowning out the crowd's noise. A few clapped along, turning it all into an open joke, trampling the dignity of a child. While the crowd fed on their thrill, Nyah lay curled on her side, her small body folded tight. Her breath came in sharp bursts, lungs aching under the weight, shoulder burning with numb pain. The oversized gloves hit the floor with dull thuds, reminding her she was lost in a game never meant for her. But through the daze, she pushed her hands down, inching herself up bit by bit, knees shaking, legs unsteady, hair stuck to her sweat-soaked forehead. But her body refused to stay down. The crowd screamed louder as she moved, voices cutting through the noise. "Stay down, you coward! Don't waste your breath! Bow your head!" Each word was like an arrow aimed straight at her mind, demanding she surrender. But in the blinding lights, through the harsh roars, Nyah's eyes began to change. The tears still clung, the gaze still shook, but deep within those dark eyes, something had lit up. A tiny spark, faint but undeniable. Nyah braced one hand on her knee, trying to stand. Her breath came so fast it felt like her chest would burst. Her head spun wildly, but she kept moving inch by inch. She bit down hard on her lower lip, teeth clenched until blood broke through, dripping to her chin, sharp and salty on her tongue. The taste of blood mixed with sweat reached her head, making her more alert, more in pain, but more determined. A memory flashed. Her damp little house in Kingston, her mother stitching under a dim oil lamp, repeating again and again, "Nyah, wherever you are, you keep your back straight." That image surged up, crowding the pain, lighting a fire beneath her will. Valerie stood ahead, eyes gleaming with contempt. She spread her arms wide, voice sharp, caught clearly by the referee's mic. "Get up, kid. I want to knock you down again, so the whole world sees just how weak you are." The crowd screamed in approval, applause pounding like a pack of wolves circling prey. But Valerie froze for a beat, because Nyah's eyes no longer flinched. The girl stared directly at her, eyes bloodshot and wet, but burning with pride. It wasn't the look of someone beaten. It was the look of a child refusing to bow. The crowd hadn't noticed the shift, still yelling and laughing. But in that moment, between the two in the ring, the air suddenly changed. Valerie frowned slightly, unsure if she believed the quiet challenge in front of her. But Nyah, though still trembling, gripped her gloves tight and stood tall. Blood still traced her lip, her body still wavered, but her eyes had changed. To her, that first punch wasn't just pain. It was a reminder that humiliation couldn't end with staying down. The crowd didn't stop. Voices, laughter, and shouting tangled into a storm. A few in the sea of faces fell quiet when they saw the small figure rising. They glanced at each other, hesitation flickering in their eyes. But the roar of the majority swept it away. Valerie kept smirking, trying to hold her confidence, but a flicker of frustration crept into her chest. That punch should have ended this spectacle. Yet the girl still stood, still held her head high. Nyah took a deep breath, chest rising and falling, her eyes locked straight on her opponent. In her mind, one thought echoed, "I won't let them see me fall." And in that moment, beneath the blaze of dozens of lights, amid the screams of the crowd, a fragile silence formed, one that existed only between the two people in the ring. Valerie noticed it. The audience had not yet, but Nyah had already seized it. The first real blow had landed, leaving the small body aching, but it had also ignited a fire inside. As Nyah slowly pushed herself up, blood staining the corner of her mouth, her eyes no longer belonged to a helpless child, but to a spirit preparing to step beyond fear. And from that moment on, tonight would no longer go the way the crowd expected, because the humiliation they cheered for would begin to be replaced by something none of them had seen coming. A quiet, fierce resistance born from that brutal strike. Valerie stepped in closer, her eyes full of challenge, glaring down at Nyah like a predator scenting blood. The ring blazed under dozens of high-mounted floodlights, their cold white glare turning everything stark. The packed rows of spectators, the dripping sweat on the small Jamaican girl's face. The crowd was still in uproar after the fall, sharp applause cracking like whips, piercing whistles slicing through air thick with beer, sweat, and raw, vulgar excitement. In the middle of the chaos, Valerie leaned down, her glove nearly touching Nyah's face, voice cutting with disdain, each word clear. "You're nothing but trash!" Her words boomed through the mic, setting off another explosion in the arena. Thousands responded, shouting, slapping seats, some jumping up and yelling, celebrating the insult like it were a victory. But in Nyah's ears, the noise suddenly grew distant. In the middle of it all, her head sank into a fog, everything fading, leaving only the wild thump of her heart echoing into memory. And then, her mother's face returned, so vivid it felt real again. The shabby room in Kingston appeared before her eyes, the stained ceiling, cracked walls, a small oil lamp casting its weak glow over the thin hands stitching cloth. That woman, worn and hollow-cheeked but sharp-eyed, looked up at her daughter and said with calm conviction, "You don't bow your head, Nyah." She didn't shout, but the tone etched itself deep, carving into the child's heart. Nyah remembered the warmth of her mother's hand on her shoulder, the tired but proud smile, the lines around her eyes etched by years of hardship. All those memories surged back, stronger than any insult being thrown at the girl in the ring. Outside, the arena remained loud and relentless. Spectators in the front rows shouted until their faces turned red, throats strained, shoving each other to get a better view. Shoes stomped the wooden floor like war drums, matching Nyah's racing pulse. Someone tossed a plastic bottle that clattered near the ring's edge, trying to spice up the spectacle. But within that ocean of noise, a few eyes began to dim. A middle-aged man in a suit frowned, gripping his seat, murmuring to his companion, "This has gone too far. This isn't boxing anymore." A silver-haired woman nodded, lips trembling. "She's still just a child. How did this even happen?" Their whispers were faint, drowned by the shouting, but they reached a few nearby ears, planting a seed of doubt in a crowd that had only known hunger for blood. Nyah stood unsteady, her back pressed against the ropes, heavy gloves hanging low as if they might pull her frail body down. Tears had welled up, but she refused to let them fall. In her eyes, fear still lingered. Pain was still sharp, but deep inside, a flame had risen from her mother's memory. She clenched her jaw, bit her lip until it bled, the metallic taste on her tongue a bitter reminder that she was still here. In the harsh lights of the arena, Nyah slowly lifted her head, her gaze igniting like fire flaring from ash. Valerie hesitated. Even she hadn't expected a small, fragile girl to meet her eyes with a look like that. It was no longer just fear, no more trembling or lowered head, but a burning stare that seemed to say pain couldn't erase pride. Valerie frowned, glove raised, but something unfamiliar crept into her chest. Her smug confidence faltered for half a beat, as she realized her opponent was no longer a toy to break. The crowd kept shouting, noise crashing through the arena, but between Valerie and Nyah, a silent space had formed, a pause the audience hadn't yet felt, but on that note that the two fighters understood clearly. In that silence, Nyah's eyes burned, lit by her mother's word, by memory, by the humiliation she'd just endured. That small shift, seemingly meaningless in a roaring crowd, was the turning point, when a child stopped being a victim and became someone ready to resist. A few in the audience began to still, a few heads lowered, whispers spreading across the seats. They didn't know what had just changed, but they saw Valerie's certainty waver. And Nyah, thin, exhausted, blood on her lips, stood straighter than before, her eyes brighter than ever. In that moment, the entire arena seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move no one could predict. The arena seemed to hold its breath as Valerie clenched her fists, her eyes flashing with rage and thrill. She spun fast, body sleek like a panther, unleashing an uppercut with full force and speed that would make any professional fighter wary. The punch sliced through the air, a sharp sound like the wind being torn apart. Every eye in the crowd followed the arc of the strike, ready to witness the moment Nyah would be completely taken down. But then, the unexpected happened. Her small body dropped instinctively, dipping lower than Valerie's glove, slipping cleanly under the punch that seemed impossible to dodge. The entire arena jolted. The screaming stopped. Thousands of voices silenced for a few stunned seconds. The weight of that silence was sudden, shocking, so heavy you could hear Nyah's gasping breath on the floor, hear the scrape of Valerie's shoe on the wood. Phones shook in the hands of those filming, lenses tilting, crowds frozen as if they couldn't trust their own eyes. They had come prepared to laugh, to clap, to witness humiliation, but the moment that punch missed and the girl ducked low, shattered their smug anticipation. In that blink of time, Nyah hadn't fully realized what she'd done. Her body moved on a survival instinct, knees still trembling, heavy gloves dragging her arms down, one hand flung upward without thought. It wasn't a proper punch, had no power, no direction, just a desperate swipe from someone clinging to breath. Yet somehow, it landed, brushing Valerie's face. The sound was soft, barely audible from afar, but in the charged air, that touch echoed like thunder. Valerie froze. The smug smile vanished, her eyes wide for a moment. Her body flinched, then stepped back as if struck by insult. Rage ignited in her gaze, pupils burning, face flushing with shame. "You hit me?" she roared, voice hoarse, crashing through the arena. That sound snapped the crowd back to life, shattering the silence into shouts, but this time, the laughter wasn't as loud. For the first time since the match began, they didn't look at Nyah as entertainment. They saw a small threat that had just challenged Valerie's power. The audience stirred, rows shifting, mouths hung open, people turned to each other, faces lit with disbelief. "She touched Valerie!" a young man shouted, more shocked than angry. An elderly woman murmured, a faint smile flickering. "She fought back, dear God. She actually fought back." The voices were soft, but enough to make more than a few brows furrow. And Valerie was different now. The shame of having a weak child's glove touch her face spread like wildfire, scorching the invincible confidence she always carried. Veins rose along her neck, her fists clenched tight, knuckles cracking loudly in the silence. In Valerie's eyes, Nyah was no longer a fragile prey. She had become the one who dared to insult her pride in front of thousands. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury, sparked and spiraling fast. Nyah breathed hard, eyes still wide as if she couldn't believe her clumsy swing had landed. Her chest heaved, blood still dripping from her lip. But inside, something stirred, something fierce and wordless. Her mother's voice echoed, the memory now burning into strength. "You don't bow your head," Nyah told herself, and the fire lit her gaze. She stood unsteady, shoulders trembling, but her spine was straighter now, her eyes fixed on her opponent with a look small but sharp enough to dig under Valerie's skin. The arena shifted again, the crowd's voice no longer a single roar. Some still screamed for Valerie, demanding she crush the spark of rebellion that had just flared, but others spoke up, quieter, yet clear. "She did it. The girl won't back down." These layered waves of emotion tangled in the air, no longer a chorus of amusement, but something heavier, tense and uneven. Valerie licked her lips, smirked with a low growl, but it wasn't the confident grin she'd worn before. It was the smile of someone provoked, someone who refused to be disgraced. She dropped her stance, raised her gloves, eyes locked on Nyah's bloodied, sweat-covered face. The entire crowd felt a chill crawl down their backs, because they knew the match, once a public joke, had now turned down a path no one had predicted. And at the center of that chaos, the small but unshaken spark in Nyah's eyes flickered just bright enough to shake the walls of power Valerie and her enablers thought were untouchable. Valerie stepped back after the unexpected hit, her breath ragged, as if the blow had insulted her to the bone. The moment her hand touched her cheek, the spot where Nyah's clumsy swing had landed, her proud face twisted, eyes bloodshot like wildfire. A growl escaped her lips, no longer filled with amusement, but heavy with fury. Then came the roar, louder than the speakers, louder than the crowd, shaking the entire arena. "I'm going to crush you!" Her voice was raw, like a beast challenged in front of thousands, stripped of all restraint. Immediately, the police row jumped to their men in deep blue uniforms shouting in unison, "Finish her! Show her where she belongs!" Their vicious chant spread across the arena like an order from some unseen force, desperate to stomp out the spark that had dared to rise. Feet pounded in thunderous rhythm, each stomp a hammer blow on the wooden floor, the crowd following with sharp claps, turning the air into a suffocating storm, all of it crashing toward Nyah, the child once seen as a toy who had just committed the ultimate offense, striking back. At the center of the storm, Nyah stood unsteady, gasping like she couldn't get enough air, raspy breaths scratching from a dry throat. Her chest rose and fell, body soaked in sweat, oversized gloves dragging her arms down, legs trembling beneath her. But unlike before, she didn't shrink back, didn't retreat to the ropes like prey about to be torn apart. Instead, Nyah held her ground, spine pulled straight, her small hands clenched inside the heavy glove. Her eyes were still wet, but her gaze burned, quiet but fierce. That look, fragile as it seemed, carried the weight of a promise. She would not bow again. The crowd wavered, voices still shouting, but something shifted. Glances turned strained, murmurs grew uncertain. Faces from the back rows leaned toward each other, whispering in disbelief. They couldn't grasp what they were seeing. A child, small and vulnerable, standing firm before a woman burning with wrath. This arena, once thrilled by blood, now witnessed something else. A flicker of pride rising from the deepest pit of weakness. Amid the crowd, a sharp sound broke through the chaos. A wooden cane struck floor with a solid crack. Heads near the noise whipped around. An old black man, hair silver white, frame thin but eyes sharp as fire, rose to his feet in the middle of the row, leaning on his cane with the full weight of age. His voice rang out, steady and thunderous, cutting through the roar. "Enough!" The sound split the air. For one brief second, the entire arena paused, stilled under the weight of that firm voice from the old man. Eyes turned toward him instantly. A few recognized his name, Jerome Cole, a legendary fighter from decades past, a symbol long absent from the ring. That name rippled through the crowd like a quiet wave cutting through a sea of noise. Jerome Cole. He's here. Valerie heard it. Her eyes flickered with surprise. But her anger was too consuming, and she shoved the thought aside. She stomped on the floor, raised her fists again, but somewhere deep in her chest, a thread of doubt had crept in. Jerome's unexpected presence had made a portion of the audience hesitate, and she felt it. Nyah, on the other hand, caught that voice like a signal. It didn't come from the bloodthirsty crowd. It came from a steady human being, carrying the weight of experience. Enough. Those two words felt like solid ground, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this spectacle. Fear still clung to her chest, thick and heavy, but alongside it now flowed something new, something stronger, urging her to stay on her feet, grip tighter, prepare for whatever came next. The arena erupted again, but the blast was no longer unified. Cheers for Valerie clashed with shouts of protest, and whistles laced with mockery cut through the roar. The crowd had begun to splinter, and in that chaos, the image of a small but unshaken girl facing off against a raging fighter seared itself into everyone's mind. What was meant to be a match of humiliation had twisted into something no one could predict, a moment powered by resistance, now backed by the commanding voice of a long-absent legend. And in Nyah's burning gaze, tangled with Valerie's rising fury, a new storm was about to break, one that would pull the entire arena into a spiral with no way back. The sound of Jerome Cole's cane echoed sharply, causing the entire auditorium to fall silent, a rare moment when thousands of people collectively held their breath. That dry, cracking sound was not only a reminder, but it felt like a bell signaling that something immense was about to happen. However, Valerie didn't let the silence linger for long. She let out a fierce scream, a sound that tore through the air, growling like an animal cornered, and then lunged straight at Nyah. Valerie's heavy footsteps thudded on the floor like the beat of a war drum, urging her forward. Her hair, soaked in sweat, splashed with every movement of her powerful body, her broad shoulders thrusting upward, closing the gap between the dominant and the small child with an overwhelming force. No more mocking smile, no more taunting word. Valerie now stood as a raw embodiment of brute force. A sharp, straight punch, a rapid hook, and iron gloves swinging as if to crush everything in their path. The relentless barrage of strikes fell like hailstones, each punch as heavy as a hammer, capable of knocking out a seasoned opponent, let alone a frail girl. Each swing of her arm cut through the air with a shrill whistle, slamming into the audience's ears, making the entire room shudder. Nyah was dizzy from the storm of violence. Her breaths came in rapid bursts, her chest rising and falling as if it might explode. Her small legs trembled, each step backward pushing her closer to the edge. Yet survival instinct drove her faster than reason. She ducked down, sliding to the left, spinning to the right, sometimes barely missing a strike, but just enough to evade the lethal blows. Sweat streamed down her young face, mingling with tears, falling from her chin, dripping onto the glossy wooden floor beneath the lights. Her heavy gloves shielded her clumsily, her fragile body trembling with each movement. But her eyes were wide open, tracking every movement, as if searching for the smallest opening to breathe. The atmosphere became suffocating. The audience, once used to taunting cheers, now sat in stunned silence. The jeering shouts of derision vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. Everyone seemed hypnotized, holding their breath in unison, waiting to see what would happen next. Thousands of phones were trembling as they live-streamed the scene, cameras swaying urgently, the viewer count rapidly climbing from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Comments flooded the screen. "She's still standing. She dodged that punch. Valerie's losing control." In an instant, the arena, once just a place of entertainment, had become a global phenomenon, with the whole world seemingly gathering to witness the fate of a child. Valerie's strikes became more frantic with every hit. Growls erupted from her throat, sweat flying off her face, and her cheeks flushed with anger. Her eyes were wild, her pupils dilated in a frenzy. Each mistake made her more furious, and her once unwavering confidence turned into blind rage. Her steps became erratic, her breath heavy, and each punch lost its precision. The constant whoosh of her gloves cutting through the air could never land on the small body sliding ahead of her. What was once orchestrated to be a spectacle turned into an odd tragedy, the strong becoming clumsy, and the weak growing as unyielding as an unquenchable fire. Nyah was still trembling, but she did not fall. Every step of evasion made her thin shoes creak, echoing like a cry of defiance across the wooden floor. Her hair was a mess, sticking to her dirt-smeared face, but her eyes shone with an unusual intensity. Those eyes were wide, fully focused, no longer holding despair but blazing with the light of life and the instinct to fight. She was still a fragile child, but in her gaze lay a determination no one had ever seen before. Then came the moment. Valerie threw a sweeping hook, her entire strength concentrated in her arm, muscles taut, as if ready to burst. The punch seemed to promise an end, but Nyah suddenly ducked, spinning halfway around, and the tide shifted. Valerie's shoe slipped on the floor, slick with sweat. Her feet lost their balance, and her entire body staggered. The sight sent a shockwave through the audience. Thousands of eyes widened, hearts seemingly stopping in that tense moment, the fragile line between collapse and victory hanging in the balance. Nyah straightened up, her thin shoulders lifted, her eyes burning bright like two torches. Her face, drenched in blood and sweat, held a posture of defiance like never before. In that brief instant, all the noise disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence, the calm before the eruption that everyone felt was imminent. Then, like a volcano erupting, the entire auditorium exploded with intensity. No more mocking laughter, no more jeering words, only screams, cheers, and shouts of disbelief. People jumped up, clapping, yelling uncontrollably, as they had just witnessed an unbelievable turnaround. A tiny child had made the mighty falter. That moment felt eternal. The light from dozens of spotlights poured down, illuminating Nyah's young but defiant face, turning her into a living symbol of resistance. On the screens of hundreds of thousands of viewers worldwide, that image spread at a breathtaking speed. In her bright eyes, people saw not only pride, but the glimmer of justice beginning to shine through her small frame. From that moment, the world held its breath, ready to witness the fateful twist that could change everything. The air in the arena was thick enough that the pounding of hearts could be heard clearly from those standing near the ring. The smell of sweat, old wood, and the faint odor of burning from the spotlights all blended together, creating a heavy atmosphere. The sound of footsteps pounding the floor and the roar of thousands of voices filled the air like a storm about to devour everything in its path. Amidst the chaos, Valerie growled, her eyes blazing with the fury of someone deeply insulted. Her biceps bulged, veins straining as though ready to tear her skin apart, and her breath came in rapid, labored gasps that made her chest rise and fall violently. She knew her pride was hanging by a thread in front of thousands of witnesses and hundreds of thousands watching on screen. A single accidental move from Nyah was enough to fracture her dignity. That anger boiled over into blind resolve. Valerie bent down, clenched her fist, and channeled all her strength and body weight into a single blow, one she believed would end it all. The crowd seemed to roar in unison, the sound shattering the air above, with shoes pounding the floor in rhythm like the beating of war drums, each stomp urging the final, ruthless conclusion. All eyes were focused on the two figures in the ring, and everyone believed this would be the moment the tiny child would fall. No one could have imagined that in that fleeting instant, something unexpected would happen. Valerie's powerful arm swung horizontally, so fast that the naked eye could barely follow it, and many cameras even blurred in the frame. But instead of being crushed, Nyah instinctively leaned back, her small feet turning slightly, her body sliding low before she slipped out of the punch's path. The final blow rushed through the air, grazing her face by mere inches, close enough that her hair was swept up by the gust. The entire auditorium fell silent, the anticipated sound of the punch landing replaced by a suffocating stillness. Valerie felt the chilling emptiness as her fist sliced through nothingness. All her momentum drove her forward, causing her body to lose control entirely. Her sweat-slicked shoes slid across the wooden floor, her massive frame tilted too far, and her center of gravity was completely off. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Before the audience's shouts could even rise, Valerie staggered, her arms flailing like someone clutching at invisible air, her feet searching for ground. Then, with a heavy thud, her entire body crashed to the floor, her face slamming down onto the mat. The sound was so jarring that no one remained seated. It was as if a lightning bolt had struck right in the heart of the arena. A prolonged "oh" spread across the arena, like a sudden wave of shock. Hands went up to head, eyes wide in disbelief. Some laughed in surprise, while others stood frozen in stunned silence. The room was filled with a chaotic mix of emotions, hard to tell apart from amazement and excitement. Phones vibrated violently, cameras panned everywhere, and each livestream exploded with an increasing number of viewers. Comments flooded the screen. Did she really fall? Valerie fell to a child? This is history unfolding before our eyes. Amidst the chaos, Nyah stood still. Her breath came in ragged gasps, chest heaving as if it might tear her apart, her small shoulders trembling, yet her eyes were unusually bright. Her spine straightened, and her oversized gloves hung loosely at her sides, her face covered in sweat and blood but still standing tall. She didn't rush to take advantage of the opportunity, nor throw another punch. She just stood there, like a solid pillar in the flood. And that became the hardest blow to Valerie, for she didn't lose in a fight, but in her own loss of control. The camera captured every detail, the dazed expressions of the audience, the wide eyes in disbelief, the odd calmness of the Jamaican girl amidst the chaos. In the audience, Jerome Cole slammed his cane onto the floor, the sound echoing like confirmation. His eyes were sharp, reflecting the memory of a seasoned fighter, and he nodded subtly, whispering to himself. She stood up and dared the whole world to take notice. His words were quiet, but they cut through the heavy air, sending a shiver down many spines. Valerie lay sprawled out, her hair a mess, covering her flushed face, gasping for air in heavy breaths. Her eyes were wide open, filled with complete confusion. She couldn't believe how a punch she was sure would land had turned into public humiliation. Her trembling hands pressed against the floor, trying to push herself up, but the weight of failure was heavier than her own body. And across from her, Nyah, the Jamaican child with the oversized gloves, stood tall, her eyes shining amidst the countless gazes. That moment was the turning point that no one in the room could have ever imagined. The strong had fallen, and the weak had stood proudly. The noise erupted violently, reverberating like a storm sweeping through the rows of seats, echoing off the wall, and reaching the very rafters of the arena. Thousands of people stood up, screaming hoarsely, a mixture of shock and excitement. Cameras panned frantically from wide angles to close-ups, capturing the image of the once arrogant figure now sprawled on the floor. Some reporters scrambled to take pictures, flashes flashing relentlessly, embedding the moment into the memories of those who witnessed it. The chatter swelled like a wave, some clapping continuously, others shaking their heads in disbelief, and there were even bursts of laughter, a blend of gloating and astonishment. The livestream views skyrocketed to record numbers, with comments flooding in. "Unbelievable, Valerie fell. What did that girl just do? This is definitely the viral clip of the year." Amid the chaos, Nyah stood still like a statue. Her frail body trembled, but her eyes burned brightly. She tilted her head, staring up at the blinding lights hanging from the ceiling, where the beams of white light pierced down like spears, illuminating the stains on the wooden floor and the beads of sweat rolling down her face. In that gaze, Nyah seemed to separate herself from the crowd, no longer hearing the shouting around her, only seeing the vast sky where she poured all her strength to prove she existed. Gradually, silence began to seep into the noise. Some spectators stopped yelling, slumping back into their seats, silently watching the small figure standing tall. They realized that the victory in this moment wasn't the punch that landed, nor Valerie's collapse, but the poise of a child daring to hold her head high. In front of thousands of eyes, Nyah had transformed into a symbol of resistance, with her silence filled with pride. Valerie remained on the floor, struggling to push herself up, but no one was paying attention to her anymore. All eyes were on Nyah. In an instant, there were no more mocking laughs, no more taunts, only respect and disbelief. The child who was once treated as entertainment had made the entire arena go quiet, listening to every breath, every lift of her head. Though her body was bruised, her legs shaking from exhaustion, the light in her eyes had become a guiding flame for all those still in doubt. At that moment, time seemed to stop. The initial screams transformed into a wave of new, unfamiliar emotion, overwhelming yet exhilarating. Anyone present that day knew they had witnessed an unforgettable turning point. Nyah didn't need another punch. Her standing tall under the lights was enough to stir a sea of people, forever etching that night into history. The sound in the arena, already chaotic, was suddenly torn apart by a shrill scream from the police section. A man in a blue uniform jumped to his feet, his neck veins bulging, eyes wild with fury, his voice commanding, "Don't let the kid win. Get her up right now." The harsh shout echoed not only through the arena but also blared out of the phones of hundreds of thousands of viewers watching live. Shouts of support immediately followed from several other officers, each word spilling out in panic, unmasked. In their eyes, the confidence they once held turned into urgency and fear, for the thing no one wanted to admit had become clear. The absolute power they had always trusted had just been pierced, and their trembling voices revealed it through their meaningless command. The entire arena turned its gaze toward the scene, the mixture of astonishment and disgust palpable as they realized those meant to uphold order were now openly shattering fairness. Meanwhile, on the arena floor, Valerie remained kneeling, her long hair wet with sweat, falling over half her face. The heavy gloves lay on the ground, her arms trembling, no longer able to hold them tight. She cradled her face, her broad shoulders hunched, her whole body shaking as if battered by a storm. All the arrogance, the mocking smile, the defiant tilt of her chin from the start of the match had been swept away by the storm, leaving only this complete contrast. The shouts from the stands no longer revived her spirit. Instead, they felt like daggers, twisting deeper into her humiliating wound. Valerie could feel, with thousands of eyes upon her, that she was no longer the dominant force. no longer the symbol of invincibility, but simply a fallen human, exposed in defeat. The audience erupted with a multitude of reactions. Some yelled in unison, matching the police's fury, but most remained silent, their heavy gazes fixed on the ring. Phones continued to pan frantically, cameras capturing every agonizing moment of the once revered fighter. On the live broadcast, hundreds of thousands of comments flooded the screen. She really fell. This is the fate of arrogance. That Jamaican girl turned the fight around with pure resilience. The atmosphere in the arena, once fiery, now felt like a crashing wave, each wave pounding down as another layer of humiliation fell on Valerie. She gasped for each labored breath, her chest rising and falling, hands trembling as she pulled them away from her face. Red streaks marred her skin, the corners of her lips bleeding, her eyes lost in a mix of hatred and despair. Valerie looked up at the stands, seeing thousands of scrutinizing eyes like cold daggers, hearing the laughter, the murmurs, each word like a hammer falling down. The anger was still there, but it wasn't enough to revive the image that had shattered. What hurt her more than the punch from her opponent was the fact that she had shattered herself, consumed by her own rage. This fall wasn't caused by an external force, but by the blind pride that had pushed her to the bottom. The harsh light from the overhead spotlights exposed every drop of sweat and tear mingling on her contorted face. The wooden floor, damp with sweat, reflected a completely different Valerie, no longer glowing, just a woman kneeling before the public. Amid the meaningless shouts from the police section, the truth became clearer and clearer. This match no longer belonged to Valerie. Every furrowed brow, every click of the camera, every breath from the crowd seemed to etch her sentence deeper. The pride that had consumed her now turned into the blade that ended her. And in the midst of this, Nyah stood tall, her small frame glowing under the lights. She didn't need to move, nor did she need to say a word. Her silence was the true response, the real twist that left the entire arena stunned. A child who had been pulled into the ring as entertainment was now turning into the figure the whole world had to watch, while Valerie, the once proud fighter, cradled her face in shame that could never be wiped away. This wasn't just a reversal in a match, it was a fundamental overthrow, a twist of fate that revealed the truth. True strength doesn't lie in heavy punches, but in standing firm when everyone expects you to fall. Nyah stood in the center of the spotlight, her breath heavy, the oversized gloves hanging by her sides, her small face dotted with sweat and specks of blood, but her eyes still burning brightly. In that suffocating silence, she slightly lowered her head, her lips barely moving as she whispered, her voice weak but clear through the microphone surrounding the floor. "I'm not a joke." The words, faint enough to be swallowed by the surrounding noise, became crisp when broadcast, touching every corner of the arena, weaving through every row of seats, piercing the ears of those who had just shouted for her to fall. No shout could overpower those words. On the contrary, the entire arena froze, a wave of shock spreading as if an invisible force had gripped everyone, because it wasn't a roar, a struggle, but enough to shake every prejudice that had just formed. The scrutinizing gazes softened, and many people suddenly realized they were witnessing something beyond the bounds of a simple match. Some spectators held their heads in their hands, tears unexpectedly falling, unsure whether it was from emotion or from shame as they recalled joining in the mocking laughter. Nyah's calmness in her words rendered all the ridicule meaningless in an instant. She didn't need to prove herself with a punch, didn't need to win through bloodshed. Just one simple affirmation was enough to shift the entire atmosphere. Amid thousands of people, she stood tall, not with strength, but with self-respect. And it was this that turned her whisper into a thunderous strike. As that moment passed, a flurry of phones all paused on the same scene. Short clips captured Nyah looking up, her eyes shining under the spotlight, her face battered but calm, her lips murmuring words that shook the arena. Just minutes later, these clips began to surface online, spreading like wildfire. On various platforms, the videos were shared at breakneck speed, every second bringing tens of thousands of views, every minute hundreds of thousands of shares. Comments flooded in. "A little girl taught us what true pride is. This isn't a boxing match, this is history. These words will echo forever." News outlets jumped into action that very night. From small sports pages to major television networks, they all showcased the Jamaican girl in oversized gloves, standing under blinding lights, whispering words that made the world go silent. Headlines poured in. "Not a joke, a declaration of a generation. The girl who stood against power when a child redefines justice. The hashtag bearing Nyah's name flooded the platforms, climbing to the top of global trends. Each language translated her word, but no matter if it was in English, Spanish, or French, the spirit remained unchained. A child declaring her dignity. In major cities, the square screens lit up as the clip was replayed, with groups of people unexpectedly gathering, silently listening to those few words, then clapping loudly as if they were right in the arena. Some cried, others recorded the moment to share online, adding the caption, "I witnessed the birth of an icon." Many street artists painted murals inspired by that image, her bright eyes, and bloodied but proud face. Some young musicians used Nyah's words as the foundation for new songs, turning them into melodies that spread throughout the community. The online storm didn't just stop at emotions, it sparked intense debates about honor, injustice, and the human values that were thought to be self-evident but had been trampled upon. Articles and analyses flooded in, and interview shows went on all night, with Nyah's image always at the center. Human rights activists called it a symbol of resistance, and many compared it to historical moments that changed societal perceptions. From a child who seemed to be forced into the ring to be a joke, Nyah had become the face of dignity and pride. That night, the dilapidated arena of a small town became the focal point of the entire world. Valerie knelt in humiliation. The police showed clear signs of unease, while Nyah, with just one sentence, had turned the tables. That brief clip became the wind that blew away the walls of prejudice, making millions of people realize that justice sometimes starts with a small voice. And before dawn broke, Nyah Campbell's name was shining across all platforms, like a flame that had just been lit, illuminating the path of truth and dignity. In just one night, newspapers everywhere were filled with images of the young Jamaican girl with oversized gloves, standing tall in the brightly lit arena, her face drenched in sweat, but her eyes shining with determination. The photo was printed on the front page with a bold headline, "Jamaican Girl Stands Tall Against Injustice." Gone were the mockery and laughter. In their place was a tone of deep respect. Sports magazines described it as a moment that redefined the meaning of a fight, while social columns hailed Nyah as the new symbol of courage. Many journalists analyzed how rarely a boxing match could transcend sports and become a social milestone, emphasizing that it wasn't the punch, but the gaze and stance that made history. The image spread rapidly. Fashion magazine, which typically had little interest in boxing, featured Nyah on their covers, praising the strength emanating from a child. Major online platforms recreated the moment with graphics, comparing Nyah to past icons who fought against injustice. On social media, the image of her holding her head high quickly became the avatar for millions of accounts, from celebrities to ordinary people. Everywhere, Nyah was mentioned as proof that honor doesn't belong to the strong, but to those who keep their backs straight in the storm. The media attention quickly triggered a wave of reactions from human rights organizations. The International Organization for Children's Rights issued an official statement, declaring the incident as clear evidence of abuse of power and discrimination. They called for a comprehensive investigation and demanded assurances for Nyah's and her family's safety. Women's rights organizations also spoke out, stating that this was not just a boxing match, but a mirror reflecting the ongoing discrimination. They sent open letters to the authorities, demanding a satisfactory explanation and committed to supporting Nyah in her future journey. Speeches quickly appeared on human rights forums. Speakers emphasized that Nyah's image was not merely an emotional moment, but proof that the world needed a new dialogue about justice. Human rights lawyers likened her to a wake-up call, stating that no one was too small to be silent, and no one had enough power to conceal the truth. Many international organizations extended invitations to Nyah to attend conferences, hoping she would share her story as a source of inspiration. The heat from the incident also forced the political sphere to take notice. Several lawmakers in major countries raised the issue in parliamentary sessions, calling for condemnation of the abuse against children. They cited Nyah as evidence of the urgent need to reform the juvenile protection system. International leaders spoke out in support, sending encouraging messages and recognizing her as a symbol of a new generation willing to fight against injustice. Some even quoted her words directly in their speeches, affirming that justice doesn't just come from the courts, but from those who dare to speak the truth. This wave of justice surged like a rising tide, sweeping along communities that had long silently endured. Many marginalized groups organized marches with the slogan, "We are not a joke," turning her small but powerful statement into a global rallying cry. In schools, teachers shared Nyah's story to encourage students to stand up for themselves. Online, numerous fundraising campaigns were launched to support Nyah and other children facing injustice, with donations quickly surpassing expectations in just a few days. From what had been a spectacle, Nyah had sparked an unprecedented movement. The press no longer focused on the punches, but on the pride she had shown. Human rights organizations not only defended her but also used her story to open up a broader discussion about fairness. In each step of this transition, Nyah Campbell's name resonated as a symbol, a reminder that justice can begin with the upright stance of a small girl, but its power can shake the world. The media, already ablaze with images of Nyah's courage, erupted even further as several international newspapers began to delve into the role of the police in the entire incident. Video clips of the shouting, "Get her up," were cut and broadcast repeatedly on major news channels, accompanied by bold red text, "Who ordered a child to face violence?" Public outrage erupted, relentlessly calling out the officers present that night, demanding accountability for their abuse of power. The faces that once sat comfortably in the stands now appeared on the front pages. Their condemning expressions and shouts turned into clear evidence of their complicity. Legal analysts bluntly declared this to be the biggest scandal in years. Not just a personal offense, but a collapse of public trust in those who were supposed to be guardians of justice. The outrage spread like an uncontrollable wildfire, with each passing hour bringing more targeted articles and discussion programs questioning industry leaders. People took to the streets, holding hastily scribbled signs with the names of the officers, viewing them as symbols of injustice. Hashtags calling for investigation, firing, and prosecution spread widely, topping trend lists on various platforms. The pressure mounted, forcing authorities into action. Quick apologies were issued, but instead of calming the storm, they only fueled further anger due to their superficiality and lack of sincerity. It became clear that only true justice could quell the rising tide of fury. Meanwhile, Valerie, once hailed as the undefeated female fighter, began to face widespread boycott. Initially, there was debate about whether she was also a victim of pressure and circumstances, but when images of mockery, disdainful smiles, and brutal blows from her were replayed, sympathy quickly turned into contempt. Brands that had previously sponsored her announced they were ending their contracts, and her fight invitations were quietly canceled. On forums, fans tore up banners with her image, sharing clips of them burning her fight shirts as a form of punishment for a symbol that had betrayed their expectations. The boycott didn't just come from the public, but also crept into her personal life. Friends distanced themselves, former colleagues kept silent, and even in familiar training rooms, Valerie was no longer welcomed. She walked the streets under the cold gaze of passers-by, each step weighed down by mocking whispers. Social media was flooded with criticisms, even ridicule, with many seeing her as a living example of fallen arrogance. From a shining icon, Valerie became an outcast, her name now synonymous with shame rather than victory. Old interviews that once praised her confidence were now revisited, interspersed with scenes of her kneeling on the ring floor. People compared this stark contrast to a bitter lesson, a warning that brilliance could not conceal a lack of respect. Even as Valerie attempted silence, avoiding the spotlight, the public storm refused to relent. Each day, more supplementary stories emerged, with some claiming to have witnessed her arrogance toward weaker opponents, while others recalled times when she carelessly hurled insults without a second thought. The public's anger toward the police and contempt for Valerie rose simultaneously, creating an unprecedented wave. Where Nyah was once seen as entertainment, those who had mocked and oppressed her became the target of ridicule and judgment. Justice began to form not just in courtrooms or legislative halls, but in the hearts of millions who had witnessed an irreversible truth. In this wave, Nyah no longer needed to speak, as her silent dignity had already caused those who once stood above her to bow their heads in shame. In the days when the public outrage still roared over the scandal, Nyah lived in a small house on the outskirts of Kingston with her mother. Both faced the curious and pitying glances of their neighbors while dealing with the exhaustion of hearing Nyah's name constantly mentioned in the media. Every night, the light in their room stayed on until late, the yellow light dimly illuminating Nyah's pale, weary face from the pressure. Yet, in her eyes, there still burned a strange light, the light of someone who dared to stand up before an entire crowd. One afternoon, after Nyah returned from a nearly abandoned training field near her home, the creaky wooden gate slowly opened, and there, standing outside, was an elderly figure waiting. The man, leaning on a cane, moved slowly, his white hair and deeply wrinkled face telling the story of his years. His eyes were sharp, watching Nyah not with the curious gaze of the world, but with a rare understanding. The man was Jerome Cole, a name many young people wouldn't recognize. But to the older generation, he was a boxing legend from Jamaica who had shaken international rings before quietly disappearing after a devastating injury. Jerome looked at Nyah for a long while, then slowly spoke, his voice low and hoarse with the passage of time. "I saw how you stood in that ring. That wasn't ordinary courage. It was a rare kind of strength, but if you don't learn to control it, that strength will consume you." The words struck Nyah, as it was the first time someone hadn't asked if she was afraid or ashamed, but instead spoke about her strength. Jerome told Nyah about his younger days, about the brutal fights he had endured, the fleeting glory, and the harshness of the spotlight. He didn't boast of victories, but spoke with the calmness of someone who had paid the price with his own body. He said that boxing wasn't about proving who was stronger, but about learning balance, not letting anger or pride take control. When Nyah shyly asked why he had come to her, Jerome simply replied, "Because I see in your eyes that you need a guide, not to seek revenge, but to learn how to defend yourself, to keep from falling again." The offer shook Nyah's heart. She recalled the heavy punches she had endured, the blinding lights and mocking laughter, and the moments when all she could do was instinctively dodge. There was still fear in her, but also a desire never to be the weak one pushed around again. When Jerome extended his worn, calloused hand to her, Nyah hesitated for a moment before placing her small hand into his. That gentle but firm grip felt like a silent promise that, from now on, she wouldn't have to walk alone. In the days that followed, under Jerome's guidance, Nyah began her first lessons. These weren't powerful punches or finishing moves, but techniques to maintain balance, breathing exercises to control her heart rate, and ways to keep her gaze steady, not letting fear take over. Jerome was patient, adjusting her posture and every step. He was strict, but never cold, each lesson filled with care, like a father passing on his final legacy. Each day, Nyah could feel her body changing, her legs becoming more agile, her arms stronger, and most importantly, her heart steadier. Unlike the glaring lights and noise of the boxing ring, the small training area with broken fences offered Nyah a new sense of peace. She realized that Jerome wasn't teaching her to defeat others, but to conquer her own fear. Every time she fell, he would say, "Get up, not to beat someone else, but to prove you still have the strength to keep going." His words were etched deeply in her mind, becoming the motivation for Nyah to train relentlessly. Jerome's presence became a solid anchor, a true protector. He didn't seek revenge for her, nor did he promise any glory, but he gave her the tools to maintain her dignity. That was what made Nyah feel truly strong. In her eyes, Jerome wasn't just a former legend. He was a guiding flame, lighting the path she would follow, ensuring that no matter how fierce the storm outside, she could stand tall, just like the way he once stood, and just like how the world saw her stand proudly on that fateful night. Nyah entered her first training sessions with Jerome cautiously, but each day, she realized she no longer had to face this difficult journey alone. Before, when the arena lights turned off, she was left alone in a dark, small room with only the sound of her own heartbeat. But now, every morning when she woke up, Nyah knew someone was waiting outside to guide her, teaching her lessons not just in technique, but in perseverance. Jerome's firm handshake, the gentle reminders after each stumble, and his stern yet trusting gaze all embedded deeply in her heart, making Nyah feel protected. She began to believe that the world wasn't just filled with ridicule and mockery, but also with companionship and trust, which had helped her rise again. This newfound belief gave her a sense of steadiness like never before, making each step and every punch lighter, knowing she no longer had to bear it all alone. The feeling of belonging did not just come from Jerome, but from the subtle changes in the community around Nyah. A few neighbors who used to just watch now smiled at her when they met outside, and some curious children stood by the fence, watching her train with admiration in their eyes. These simple moments felt like small threads connecting Nyah to something greater than herself. She was no longer the child who was made a spectacle, but had become a source of inspiration for those who quietly observed her. In her heart, the loneliness that had weighed her down for months began to crack, making room for the light of hope. On the other hand, Valerie had to face a cold reality she had never experienced before. After the fall of her glory, the people who once lifted her up now turned their backs in silence. The compliments disappeared. The phone stopped ringing with event invitations and was replaced by indifferent messages, even mocking ones. Every time she stepped outside, Valerie felt the harsh stare, the whispers behind her back. The image that once made her proud and strong now became a burden, making it hard for her to lift her head. In her apartment, the air was suffocating, and the white walls only emphasized her isolation. Her once close training partner now made excuses to avoid her, leaving Valerie to train alone in empty gyms. The isolation not only came from the public, but also eroded her mind. Valerie had been accustomed to cheers, bright lights, and the feeling of being the center of attention, but now silence was her only companion. She looked in the mirror and saw the face that once proudly stood tall, now worn and tired, eyes lacking sleep, shoulders slumped under the weight of scorn. No one cheered her on, no one called her name, and the pride that had once fed her now became the chains pulling her to the depths of rejection. That feeling made Valerie feel like she was sinking into an abyss. No matter how many times she punched the bag, the sound echoed, but couldn't drown the emptiness in her heart. This contrast grew more evident, with Nyah, the small girl, slowly regaining strength thanks to the guidance and trust of those around her, and Valerie, the arrogant one, now drowned by that very arrogance. Nyah felt she was not alone, while Valerie sank into isolation. One had steady steps on the training floor, the other had heavy steps in an empty corridor. And this opposition revealed a message that everyone could see. True strength doesn't come from defeating an opponent, but from having someone by your side to keep you from falling. Nyah found a protector, Valerie lost everything, and both paths left an undeniable mark in the eyes of the world, a testament to the justice that was gradually emerging. The feeling of belonging did not just come from Jerome, but also from the subtle changes in the community around Nyah. A few neighbors who once merely observed now smiled at her when they met outside, and some curious children stood by the fence, watching her train with admiration in their eye. These simple moments felt like small threads connecting Nyah to something larger than herself. She was no longer the child made a spectacle, but had become a source of inspiration for those who quietly watched her. In her heart, the loneliness that had weighed her down for months began to crack, making room for the light of hope. On the other hand, Valerie had to face a cold reality she had never experienced before. After the fall of her glory, the people who once lifted her up now turned their backs in silence. The compliments disappeared. The phone stopped ringing with event invitations and was replaced by indifferent messages, even mocking ones. Every time she stepped outside, Valerie felt the harsh stares, the whispers behind her back. The image that once made her proud and strong now became a burden, making it hard for her to lift her head. In her apartment, the air was suffocating, and the white walls only emphasized her isolation. Her once close training partner now made excuses to avoid her, leaving Valerie to train alone in empty gym. The isolation not only came from the public, but also eroded her mind. Valerie had been accustomed to cheers, bright lights, and the feeling of being the center of attention, but now silence was her only companion. She looked in the mirror and saw the face that once proudly stood tall, now worn and tired, eyes lacking sleep, shoulders slumped under the weight of scorn. No one cheered her on, no one called her name, and the pride that had once fed her now became the chains pulling her to the depths of rejection. That feeling made Valerie feel like she was sinking into an abyss. No matter how many times she punched the bag, the sound echoed, but couldn't drown out the emptiness in her heart. This contrast grew more evident, with Nyah, the small girl, only regaining strength thanks to the guidance and trust of those around her, and Valerie, the arrogant one, now drowned by that very arrogance. Nyah felt she was not alone, while Valerie sank into isolation. One had steady steps on the training floor, the other had heavy steps in an empty corridor. And this opposition revealed a message that everyone could see. True strength doesn't come from defeating an opponent, but from having someone by your side to keep you from falling. Nyah found a protector, Valerie lost everything, and both paths left an undeniable mark in the eyes of the world, a testament to the justice that was gradually emerging. As public opinion continued to swirl with debates about Nyah's fateful twist, a shocking clip suddenly appeared on social media, like oil thrown onto a fire already raging. The video, less than 2 minutes long, was blurry, as if hastily filmed from some hidden corner, but the sound was chillingly clear. In the frame, a group of police officers in blue uniforms was standing near the ring, their voices sharp and full of venom. "You need to make the audience laugh, understand? Turn it into a joke." And the one receiving the orders was none other than Valerie, her face tense, her eyes uneasy, and her lips pressed tight in silence. The clip ended with the smug laughter of those in power, exposing the truth that the entire match was not merely the arrogance of a fighter, but a staged act meant to humiliate a child. Just minutes after it was posted, the clip spread at an unimaginable speed. Shares flooded in, accompanied by outrage. So it was all just coercion. They turned a little girl into a sacrifice to satisfy their power. This is a crime, not sports. Major news outlets immediately got involved, verifying the source and airing it on national television. The weak defense from the police, claiming the clip was edited, was unconvincing, as the audio and visuals were too authentic, each laugh and command ringing out like a knife slicing through public trust. Global outrage erupted fiercely. People were not only outraged by an unfair match, but by the truth that showed power had been used to turn a child into an entertainment tool. In the streets, small protests began to form, with people carrying signs that read, "No more spectacles. Give Nyah her justice." Human rights groups seized the opportunity to call for further investigation, asserting that the incident had transcended the limits of a sports violation and was an expression of serious abuse of power. The outrage grew even stronger as media analysts dissected each frame, clearly pointing out Valerie's tense look at that moment. It didn't appear as though she was actively trying to humiliate someone, but rather as if she were being coerced. This caused public opinion to split into two camps. One still despised Valerie, seeing her as an accomplice. The other began to question whether she was truly the mastermind or just a puppet in the hands of those in power. Regardless of differing views, all were united in one belief: the police had been exposed and had no way out. On social media platforms, a flood of hashtags calling for the strict prosecution of the officers involved quickly went viral, dominating trends for several days. The image cut from the video, where the cold face of a police officer is contrasted with Nyah's small, vulnerable face, became a symbol of the stark divide between power and victimhood. Artists, activists, and even politicians who had seldom intervened before began speaking out. They called this an undeniable example of abuse of power, asserting that justice would never be achieved if these individuals were not prosecuted. Meanwhile, the once dismissed atmosphere of the arena that day was now being viewed through a different lens. People realized that the mocking laughter, the taunting words, were not accidental, but nurtured by a carefully orchestrated plan. The audience members who had once joined in now felt ashamed, with many publicly apologizing online for their part in the humiliation Nyah had to endure. The sense of guilt spread, turning personal outrage into a collective wave, demanding transparency and honest accountability. The revelation not only exposed the truth behind the match, also opened a much bigger door. The door for the public to face the dark shadow of power and injustice. From a leaked clip, a small boxing match had turned into a global focal point, forcing an entire system to bow to the truth. And in the midst of this fierce wave of outrage, Nyah's name was once again mentioned, no longer just as a symbol of pride, but as a living witness to the truth now brought into the light. Valerie spent many restless nights in her silent apartment, the noise of the streets failing to drown out the turmoil ripping through her heart. The leaked video had exposed every truth, leaving her with nowhere to hide, and the mocking stares from the public felt like thousands of daggers piercing her mind. She understood that if she remained silent, the image of a cruel person would follow her for the rest of her life. Facing it meant confronting her greatest fear, admitting her own weakness. On a gray, rainy afternoon, Valerie decided to visit Nyah's small house. With heavy steps and her hands buried deep in her coat pockets to hide her trembling, she stood before the old wooden door, took a deep breath, and still felt an emptiness in her chest. The door creaked open, and Nyah appeared, her face still youthful, but her eyes no longer carried the innocence they once did. Valerie almost choked, her throat dry, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. "Nyah, I need to tell you something." Her voice faltered, full of fear and pleading. Gone was the proud fighter who had once held her head high in the spotlight. Now, before Nyah stood a woman on her knees, burdened by the weight of the past. She confessed that the mocking word, the punches, were not her own choice, but orders from those in power. "I wasn't brave enough to refuse. I was wrong to let fear control me. And because of that, you had to endure all of it." Each word came out with difficulty, interrupted by labored breaths. Her hands clasped tightly as though trying to hold on to the last bit of courage she had. In that moment, the silence was so profound that the sound of rain pattering on the tin roof could be heard. Nyah looked at Valerie, her eyes no longer burning with anger, filled with a calmness that was rare for a child. She understood that the woman before her, the one who had caused her humiliation, was now trembling like a lost child. Nyah stayed silent for a long time, making Valerie even more anxious, fearing that silence was the final judgment. Then, softly, Nyah spoke, her voice steady and firm. "You're a victim too." That short sentence made Valerie break down in tears, the tears rolling down her face uncontrollably. She looked up, not believing that she was being heard, a word she couldn't even say to herself. For Nyah, those words weren't complete forgiveness, but an acknowledgement of the truth, that injustice had turned them both into pawns in a game controlled by the powerful. Nyah hadn't forgotten what she had gone through, but she also couldn't deny that Valerie had been forced within a cruel system. In that moment, the distance between the two seemed to close. One was the girl who had once fallen in shame in the ring. The other was the proud fighter, now sharing the same truth. Both had been crushed by unseen power. Valerie knelt down, no longer maintaining her pride, looking at Nyah with eyes full of regret. Nyah, still standing tall, small yet firm, her gaze seemed to remind Valerie that, even as a victim, each person must choose how they rise. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside the small house, the air gradually calmed. Valerie felt her shoulders lighten as the truth had been spoken, while Nyah sensed a change. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, but her story had opened the door for others to admit their mistakes. Although the distance of the past remained, that moment had planted a new seed, the seed of empathy, and perhaps it was this empathy that would be the first step for true justice to take root in a world so familiar with darkness. When the leaked video stirred global outrage, the mounting pressure from public opinion forced officials to hold a public hearing. That morning, outside the Central City Courthouse, thousands gathered, holding up banners with images of Nyah and phrases like, "We are not a joke," and "Justice for Nyah," covering the square. Journalists jostled for position, cameras aimed at the main door, ready to capture every frame. Inside, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone understood that this was no longer an isolated case, but had become a measure of transparency and the public's trust in justice. As Nyah entered with her mother, the room fell silent, cameras tracking her every step. The oversized gloves were no longer on her hand. Instead, she wore a simple dress, but her eyes still shone, and her posture remained proud. Across from her, the accused police officers sat motionless in the defendant's seats, their faces tense and cold. Between them, a figure appeared who surprised the public. Marcus Hill, a young black attorney known for his human rights cases, was officially representing Nyah. Marcus stood, a slender yet firm figure, his simple suit fitting snugly, his gaze fixed firmly on the judge's bench. His voice rang clear and resolute. "Today, we are not just talking about a boxing match. We are talking about the truth, about how a child was dragged out and made a joke to serve the powers that be. Justice cannot remain silent when human dignity is trampled." His words caused the courtroom to stir, many nodding in agreement, others wiping away tears. No one saw this as a minor case anymore, but as the beginning of an unprecedented media storm. Journalists were furiously typing, each of Marcus's statements being posted almost instantly on major news websites. Headlines quickly appeared: "Young lawyer takes on power. Nyah is no longer alone." The image of Marcus standing next to Nyah, his hand gently placed on her shoulder to comfort her, quickly spread across social media, shared millions of times with the caption, "This is the justice we've been waiting for." The information storm exploded, and no one could ignore it. During the hearing, Marcus presented undeniable evidence: the audio recording, the leaked video, and witness testimonies from the audience. He dissected every detail, proving that the entire forced humiliation was not just to degrade Nyah, but reflected a system of organized abuse of power. Each time he finished speaking, whispers filled the room, and camera flashes went off. Online reporters covered every moment, and the comments flooded in. "They have no more defense. The truth is clear." Meanwhile, Nyah sat quietly, her eyes following every development. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone made the atmosphere heavy. Those who had witnessed her standing in the ring now saw her here, small yet strong, like an undeniable living witness. This image added weight to Marcus's argument, turning the personal story into a global symbol. The hearing stretched on for hours, every minute broadcast live, becoming the most watched event of the day. In large squares, people gathered to watch on massive screens, and every time Marcus finished a point, the crowd erupted in applause. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForNyah trended, with discussions surpassing even international political events. News outlets called it an unprecedented media storm, as a girl from a small town made the whole world pay attention. By the end of the session, when Marcus concluded his first argument, he turned to Nyah, offering a reassuring smile. In their eyes, there was a silent connection, a promise that justice was no longer far off. The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted in a long, continuous round of applause. Outside, people raised banners, chanting Nyah's name like calling out to a symbol of truth. The media storm had officially formed, and no power could stop it from continuing to swell. As the hearing moved to evidence verification, an unexpected turning point occurred. Jerome Cole, The man with white hair and a slow gait stood up from the audience. No one in the room could have expected that he, the boxing legend who had quietly faded from the spotlight, would be the key witness to unveil the truth. Jerome had been silent for too long, but finally he decided to step forward, not only for Nyah, but because he understood that what had happened was an offense too great, not just to her, but to humanity. When he walked up to the witness stand, the room fell silent, as if everyone was waiting for his word. Jerome didn't need to do much. Just speaking was enough to turn the tide. He brought with him the memories of his battles and the truths that could change the course of everything. His voice was deep, hoarse, filled with undeniable confidence. "I am the one who witnessed it all," he said, his gaze falling on Nyah, then shifting toward the row of police officers. "That night, I saw them not only acting inhumanely, but also staging it all to turn a young girl into a mere spectacle. What you are doing today is not justice. It is protecting those in power." Jerome's words resonated, making the entire room fall silent. No one could oppose him, only the heavy silence of those exposed. His words not only struck at those who had abused their power, but also highlighted the belief in justice, that no matter the force, truth would ultimately prevail. Outside the courtroom, the public outcry grew stronger. The media quickly picked up Jerome's testimony and continued to report on it, making the issue a global phenomenon. Every form of media covered his appearance and the words he spoke, further fueling the public's anger. Newspapers quickly ran headline stories with critical questions: police or criminals? And, when power is abused, who protects children? Comments from legal experts and human rights activists flooded forums and social media, condemning the police's brutal actions and calling for sweeping reforms in the justice system. This wave didn't stop with the media. It spread to the entire public. Millions of people watched the live broadcast of the hearing, and the comments and videos from the audience quickly reached millions of views. The international community closely followed, with many prominent figures and large organizations calling for stronger actions. Human rights organizations sent out statements urging all countries to engage in protecting children's rights, not only by prosecuting individuals, but by implementing systemic reforms. All eyes were on the court, where every second had the potential to change the course of the struggle, not just for Nyah, but for all victims pushed into the shadows of society. Although the case was causing a stir in public opinion, and Nyah had become a symbol of resilience, the shadows still hadn't released her. The attention from the media and the community wasn't enough to protect Nyah's family from the dark forces lurking in the background. Those who had held power weren't quick to accept defeat, and they had begun to retaliate in the most brutal ways. One evening, as Nyah and her mother were preparing dinner in their small home, an unexpected phone call came through. A hoarse male voice on the other end said, "Consider this a warning. Don't let your daughter continue this fight. If she does, there will be consequences." The threat was cold, and, though it lasted only a few seconds, it sent a chill down her mother's spine. There were no names, no clear address, but the tone in the voice pierced deeply. A terrifying warning. That evening, after Nyah and her mother finished dinner, they decided to step outside for a few minutes to relax. When they returned, the sight that greeted them left both of them in shock. The front gate was wide open, crude, obscene words were painted on the walls in red, splattered like bloodstains. In the distance, the sound of shattered glass echoed. A large rock lay on the floor beneath the window, where it had struck the living room window. Though no one was seen, the warning was unmistakable. They had been watched, and now, the unseen forces were trying to stir up fear in their hearts. Their home had become a target, a painful reminder that no matter where Nyah and her mother went, they would always be threatened, always have to live in the shadows of retribution. Nyah's mother felt a surge of helplessness. Fear enveloped her as she understood that despite standing for justice and receiving support from the community, there were still hidden forces willing to act violently. The price of standing up could be the safety of her own family. Nyah, though still young, understood the gravity of the situation. A sense of unease crept into her mind, but the light of resilience in her did not fade. She looked at her mother, seeing the worry on her face, then glanced at the red paint smeared on the wall. But instead of panic, she felt a fierce determination rising within her, a resolve that no matter how difficult it became, she would not let the darkness overshadow what she had achieved. That night, after the police arrived and filed the report, the paint stains still remained on the wall, and the broken glass was scattered across the floor. A sense of emptiness enveloped the entire house. But in that emptiness, Nyah realized she couldn't let fear take over. She decided she had to continue, to fight not only for herself, but for all those who had been pushed into the shadows by injustice. The community stood by her, and she knew that no matter what forces tried to threaten her family, they could never extinguish the fire in her heart. In the following days, Nyah's family received more threatening phone calls, but instead of panicking, they turned to child advocacy organizations for legal protection. Safety consultants came to their home, and special police protection was assigned to assist them. They not only protected Nyah but also helped amplify her family's voice within the community. Nyah felt more at ease, but deep down, she understood that this battle was not just taking place in the ring or in the courtroom. It was also a fight to protect her life and her dignity. Though threats in the shadows continued to emerge, Nyah knew that the unity of the community and her own resilience would be the shield protecting her. The image of her family, steadfast in the face of adversity, had become an inspiration to many others. Every time darkness loomed, Nyah grew more determined, knowing she was not alone in this fight. The threats continued to pour in, making Nyah uneasy. Every unknown phone call, every sudden knock on the door made her heart race, not out of fear, but because the growing sense of unease lingered within her. The small house was becoming a place filled with tension and anxiety, where every step, every gesture could lead to danger. Although she had received protection from human rights organizations and the police, Nyah knew the threats had never truly left her family. Yet, in those moments, Jerome was always there, the only one who made Nyah truly feel safe. One evening, as Nyah sat in the living room, a sense of fear she couldn't contain began to rise within her, and Jerome entered. He looked at her with a steady gaze, as if wanting to transmit calmness to the young girl. Though his health was no longer the same, his bright eyes still held the strength that only those with experience could understand. Jerome sat down beside Nyah, saying nothing, simply allowing her to feel his presence. Seeing this, Nyah lowered her head, her voice soft as she spoke. "I'm so scared." Jerome did not rush to answer, instead gently patting her shoulder, and in his warm voice said, "They're panicking, Nyah. Fear always makes people weak, but you're strong. You can stand tall. They cannot touch you." His words acted like a source of energy, easing some of the confusion in Nyah's heart. She took a deep breath, then lifted her head, feeling the steadiness in her heart. Before she could feel any relief, a figure appeared at the door. Nyah turned and realized it was Valerie. She stood silently at the doorway, her face showing a hint of exhaustion, but her eyes were different now, no longer filled with arrogance, but with a deep, thoughtful understanding that only those who have fallen could truly possess. In that moment, everyone in the room sensed that something had shifted in Valerie's gaze. She walked in, no longer the confident fighter, but a woman who truly understood the pain of those who had been forced into submission. Valerie sat beside Nyah, looked into her eyes, and spoke in a gentle yet determined tone. "I know you've had to endure so much, and I can't change the past, but I can stand with you right now. I will protect you, so that we are no longer afraid of those forces." Those words were like a promise, a statement that, no matter the storms they would face, Nyah was no longer alone. Although Valerie's past was filled with mistakes and wrongdoing, what she did in that moment was proof of true change. Valerie not only acknowledged her wrong actions, but also dared to stand up, to make amends, and most importantly, to stand on the side of what was right. For Nyah, this offer wasn't just protection, it was empowerment, the first step in no longer having to bear the weight of fear alone. This situation, where two people who were once on opposite sides now share the same goal, made it clear that forgiveness doesn't just come from admitting wrongs, but from taking action to create change. Valerie, though shunned and turned away by society, was still willing to stand by Nyah, showing that even when you've made mistakes, you can still choose to rise, to become part of justice instead of part of injustice. Nyah said nothing, but in her eyes, Valerie could see profound gratitude. Despite their past differences, the two were now walking together on the journey ahead, where the fight for justice was no longer just about one individual, but about all those who dared to stand up for the truth. In that moment, although the threat still loomed and everything had not been fully resolved, Nyah and Valerie knew they were no longer alone. Both had found a connection, not only from empathy, but from the courage to face their fears and fight for what was right. Nyah realized that no matter how difficult things got, she could stand firm because those around her believed in her, and she no longer had to face everything alone. The day of the final court session arrived, a day that both Nyah and Valerie knew was not just the end of a lawsuit, but a turning point in their lives. Valerie, once proud and certain of her invincibility in every fight, now stood beside Nyah, no longer bearing glory or arrogance. She stood tall, not to boast, but to prove she was ready to face her mistakes. Nyah, once a fragile girl pushed into the ring as a laughingstock, now stood beside the woman who had made her endure shame, but there was no fear in her anymore. They shook hands, a handshake that was not only a reconciliation between the two, but a symbol of profound change in each of their hearts. Both knew that what they were about to face was not just the courtroom, but their own determination to break down every barrier and fight for justice. As Nyah and Valerie stood in the waiting room, silent, neither of them spoke. They both understood that this moment was not just about proving who was right or wrong. What mattered more was that they were confronting a system that neither of them had ever imagined could change. Valerie looked at Nyah, her eyes no longer filled with arrogance, but with respect. She knew she was not standing with Nyah out of obligation, but because of a truth deeply ingrained in her. Nyah was strong, and she, who had once caused harm to her, was now learning how to stand tall for everything Nyah had endured. Valerie was no longer the victor. She was simply a woman who had come to realize her mistakes and was seeking redemption. Nyah looked at Valerie, sensing the change in every word, in every gesture. The old gloves that Jerome had passed down to her were not just tools for fighting, but reminders of the journey she had gone through. Nyah was no longer standing up for herself alone, but for all those who had been trampled by power. Why should she bow her head when justice was so close? She knew she was strong enough to face what had happened. With this handshake, Nyah and Valerie were not just sharing a moment, but giving each other the strength to continue the fight ahead. She was no longer the scared girl who once feared the crowd, but a warrior who had learned how to stand firm. As they entered the courtroom, the atmosphere became suffocating, tense. Both knew that all eyes would be on them, not just from the people in the courtroom, but from the world. The unanswered question, the unclear accusations, would all be addressed in the next hours. Valerie and Nyah stood before the court, hands clasped together, not out of fear, but out of resolve. With every step they took, with every question asked, it wasn't just about judging those who had caused Nyah's pain, but also about clarifying one important thing. Justice cannot be extinguished just because of the strength of those with power. As the trial began, Nyah's lawyer stepped forward, confident, but not rigid, with irrefutable evidence. The witnesses spoke up, and the testimonies from the police revealed the lies throughout the process. Valerie's words from the past, her actions, were no longer excuses, but confession. She could not deny that she was wrong, that her pride and fear had led her astray. But today she was not standing before the court as a criminal, but as a person seeking redemption for the harm she had caused. Nyah watched every development, her eyes bright with focus. She knew that this change was not just bringing justice for herself, but for all those who had been oppressed and trampled upon. She stood firm in the glaring light of truth, unafraid and unwavering. The old gloves were still in her hands, but now they were no longer just tools. They were a symbol of the ongoing fight. That night, when the lights in the courtroom flickered on, they knew they were no longer alone. Justice had begun. As Valerie and Nyah stood together in the waiting room, the sense of change became undeniable. Valerie was no longer the person who threw punches with arrogance, no longer the one who sought to impose her power on her opponent. The months after the previous fight had taught her a great lesson about humility and resilience. Lessons she had never fully understood before. Nyah, though still the small girl, was now the one giving Valerie faith and strength, urging her not to back down. In that quiet space, between two people with pasts full of scars, one sentence from Nyah changed everything. "This time you can't fall before you fight," she said, her voice soft but resolute. The words were not just a reminder about the next fight, but a declaration of war on Valerie's own weaknesses. Nyah didn't ask her to win at all costs, but at least to stand firm when facing adversity, to hold on to the faith in herself and what she had learned. Nyah understood that in this battle, it was not about winning, it was about refusing to let herself fall again. Valerie stood still, looking at Nyah, her eyes wide open, no longer filled with the light of pride, but with deep respect. She nodded slightly, as if making a promise, a confirmation that she would not let herself fall again. Valerie's gaze in that moment was resolute, no longer filled with doubt or confusion, but the gaze of a warrior ready to face the challenge. Nyah's words had sparked a fire in Valerie, making her no longer feel fear, not because she had become stronger, but because she had someone who believed in her. Looking at Nyah, she realized that she was not fighting alone, but with her, alongside all those who stood up to protect the truth. Valerie's nod was not just agreement, but the realization that, no matter how difficult the fight or how strong the opponent, she could not allow herself to fall. Outside the waiting room, the noise of the crowd began to filter in, filling the space with tension. Everything was preparing for a fierce battle, but in this moment, in this small room, both Valerie and Nyah knew that the most important thing was not who they would defeat, but that they would stand firm. Every next step, every punch, every move would carry pain, unhealed wound, but also the strength of belief and resilience. Both understood that, even if they lost, they would never back down because they had chosen to stand up, to face the difficulty instead of running away. When the bell rang, signaling the start of the match, Valerie stepped out of the waiting room with Nyah, no longer feeling alone, but as part of a team, even if it was just the two of them. All eyes were on them, but they no longer felt fear. In Valerie's eyes, once again, the fire of determination blazed, no longer just unconscious confidence, but belief built from the challenges they had faced. Nyah did not say another word, but she knew that determination had been ingrained in every cell of Valerie's being. She didn't need to say much. Just looking into her eyes was enough to know that this time they would stand firm. The next match was not just a fight between two opponents, but a fight to prove that no matter where, no matter the circumstance, resilience and belief in oneself are what can help one overcome any challenge. As they stepped onto the battlefield, both Valerie and Nyah knew that they had already won, no matter the outcome, because they had fought not just for victory, but for honor, for self-respect, and for the belief in a future where justice would never be overshadowed. When the trial began, a tense and anxious atmosphere filled the courtroom. Both the public and the media focused their attention on the events about to unfold. Every eye was fixed on the witness stand, where the police officers directly involved in the case sat waiting for the verdict. But the focus of everyone wasn't solely there. Everyone knew that this case wasn't just about a trial over acts of violence, but an opportunity to reveal the truth that had been hidden in the shadows for too long. Everything was being decided in that moment. As the officers began to deny the charges, rejecting all accusations, many in the courtroom felt a rising anger and disappointment. Their denial of responsibility rang out like a challenge to justice, but it couldn't erase the irrefutable evidence. The video showing Nyah being forced into the ring, everything clearly recorded and undeniable. The punches, the provocative command, those images remained intact, like a wound that couldn't heal in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The officers tried to protect themselves, but the truth was too clear. After a few tense moments of silence, Nyah's lawyer, Marcus Hill, stood up. He didn't rush, nor did he need to escalate the situation, but simply asked a question, simple yet unexpectedly powerful. Who ordered the girl to the ring? That question rang out as an affirmation of the truth and made the whole courtroom exhale. Marcus's questioning wasn't just a set of dry inquiries, but a declaration for justice, a condemnation of the abuse of power by those whom the public had trusted. Each word he spoke was like an arrow aimed straight at the heart of the truth, shaking those standing in the courtroom and making it impossible for them to continue hiding. With direct, strong, and uncompromising questioning, Marcus elevated the trial to a new level, where there was no place for silence or concealment. Each question forced the responsible parties to face what they had done, compelling them to answer for their actions. As the subsequent questions were asked, the testimonies of the witnesses, the details from the video, and everything were presented clearly and irrefutably. The police could no longer deny their actions, and the faces in the courtroom began to show signs of change. They were no longer as confident as before, their eyes no longer sharp, but instead filled with fear, with trembling as they faced the truth. They knew that all their lies had been exposed, and that concealing the truth only made their crimes worse. The video spoke for itself. The wrongful actions could no longer be denied, and justice had found its path. In the courtroom, the tension continued to rise. Everyone began to realize that not only Nyah, but the entire system had been bent by power. Each question, each answer, contributed to unsealing what had been concealed all this time. As the trial reached its conclusion, no one could hold on to their position any longer. The people behind the case could no longer defend the truth they had fabricated. They were attacked by an unexpected source of strength, the resilience of Nyah, Marcus, and all those who had stood up for justice. With each step of the trial, justice became clearer and stronger than ever before. When the final verdict of the trial was announced, no one in the courtroom was surprised. The abusers of power were held accountable, and what had happened in the dark was brought to light. Marcus's simple question had shattered every piece of the cover-up, leading to a result that everyone had been waiting for. Justice had triumphed, and the truth had been revealed. As the attention focused on each question and piece of evidence, a sudden noise broke out from the audience. A middle-aged man stood up, his serious gaze fixed, holding a worn briefcase. He was not an official witness, but his appearance immediately drew the attention of the entire courtroom. His voice was firm, yet trembled slightly as he spoke. "I heard them discussing." That statement not only tightened the atmosphere in the courtroom, but also caused every gaze from the police officers to shift toward him. A witness from the audience, someone with no reason to intervene, now offered testimony that could change the entire course of the case. Before anyone could recover from his words, he continued, "They said they would do anything to prevent the girl from winning." Those words were a shock to everyone in the courtroom. The officers sitting on the other side could not hide their confusion, and the leaders of the court turned to each other, exchanging looks full of suspicion. The audience fell silent, and in the tense atmosphere, no one dared speak. Those watching the live stream also froze, as if time had stretched out infinitely. Each word from the witness was like a line drawn, clearly marking the boundary between justice and deceit. His appearance was not only a step forward in unveiling the truth, but also a powerful punch to those who had tried to cover up their mistakes. Immediately, those present in the courtroom began to feel the tension that was enveloping the entire space. All eyes were focused on the group of police officers sitting in the defendant's bench. No one dared look at each other anymore. Instead, confusion and anxiety were visible on each face. Reporters quickly recorded the witness's testimony, while cameras panned from one angle to another to capture the shift in the atmosphere. Online comments from viewers watching the livestream exploded. Keywords like, "We've been deceived," "Who is protecting whom?" "This system has collapsed," flooded the screen. Everyone's attention was fixed on the unfolding event, and one thing was clear. Justice, despite all its cracks, could still find its way into the light. As the tension in the courtroom focused on the witness testimony, the entire room was immersed in suffocating silence. This tension wasn't just present in the space, but spread globally through every comment, every response on social media platforms. The live broadcast of the trial allowed millions of people from different countries to follow along. No longer was this just a simple trial, but a battle for justice, for the truth. Everyone understood that this wasn't merely a fight between individuals, but a struggle between hidden forces and the light of truth. In that moment, Nyah sat silently, her hands clenched, her gaze fixed on the witness without ever looking away. The anxiety she felt was no longer fear, but the tension of a final fight. She didn't speak, but in her eyes, everyone could see the resilience, the calmness that was surprisingly composed. Despite everything happening so quickly, despite the battles outside the courtroom, Nyah stood firm, maintaining her image. The young girl wasn't just fighting to protect herself, but to protect all those who had been oppressed by this system. Nyah's story is no longer just a personal tale, but has become a symbol of the fight for justice and dignity. From a child who was forced into a position of helplessness, she rose up, fought for herself, for those who were abandoned, for those who could not speak. This trial is not just about proving who is right or wrong, but about opening a larger conversation about power and responsibility in society. When the witness stood up and acknowledged what they had seen, when justice began to surface through irrefutable evidence, this trial became a pivotal moment, an unforgettable landmark in the struggle for truth. The entire courtroom fell silent, not out of fear, but due to the tension, the clear realization that the next steps would decide everything. And in that moment, when the final testimonies were given, no one doubted the truth anymore. No one sought to conceal it, because at this point, all the truths had been revealed, and justice had found its way. After many days of waiting and tension, the trial finally came to an end. All attention from the media and the public was focused on the final decisions of the court. The undeniable evidence, the testimonies from witnesses, and the videos capturing every moment of the police's misconduct had all been acknowledged. The trial, which had gone on for so long, was not only about clarifying the case, but also about affirming that abuses of power would not be tolerated, regardless of who the oppressed party was. The court concluded that the officers had abused their power, forcing and dragging Nyah into an unfair fight, intended solely to entertain those in power. They were charged for their action, and the court's ruling was like a ray of light piercing the darkness, bringing the justice that Nyah and the defenders of justice had fought for. This was not just Nyah's victory, but the victory of the truth. The police's abuse of power not only caused them to lose justice, but also made them pay for their wrongful actions. Everyone present in the courtroom knew that this trial had opened a new door, where power would no longer be allowed to manipulate the truth and justice. The public outside the courtroom seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that what they had witnessed was a turning point in the fight against injustice. Those involved in this fight were not only witnesses to the victory of a brave little girl, but also part of creating a world where justice would not be subdued. When the verdict was announced, Nyah could not hold back her tears. This was the moment she had waited for all these months, when the truth had finally been recognized and the abusers had been held accountable. However, Nyah's tears were not just for the victory, but for the feeling of being respected, for the feeling that she was no longer an anonymous child, forced into the whims of the powerful. Justice had prevailed, and for Nyah, that was a priceless gift. As everyone in the courtroom continued to applaud, expressing satisfaction with the verdict, another significant event took place. Valerie, who had once been the abuser, the one who caused Nyah's suffering, stood up. She walked towards Nyah, her gaze no longer filled with arrogance or confidence, but with regret and sorrow. She turned to Nyah, her hands trembling, and looked directly into the young girl's eyes. "I'm sorry, Nyah," Valerie said, her voice choking. "I know I was wrong. I can't change the past, but I ask for your forgiveness." Valerie's apology was not a form of self-redemption, but a deep acknowledgement that she had been wrong, that her actions were inexcusable. She didn't expect Nyah to forgive her immediately, but she knew she had to speak those words to free herself from the haunting guilt of her wrongful action. As Valerie bowed her head and apologized to Nyah, she was no longer the proud woman she once was. She was simply a person facing her mistakes, ready to accept the consequences. Nyah looked at Valerie for a long moment, her eyes still bright, but without the anger or resentment resentment she once held. She simply looked, saying nothing. The apology was not what she needed at this moment, but in that silence, Nyah understood that not all those who caused harm are incapable of change. The young girl responded gently, "You have learned your lesson, but I won't forget what happened." Her words were not a response of hatred, but an acknowledgement of the past. Nyah didn't need Valerie's forgiveness, because she knew that only when one confronts their mistakes can they truly be free. That day, not only was Nyah recognized, but everyone who followed her story also realized that justice is not just the victory of an individual, but the triumph of all those who fought, whether in darkness or light. When an abuser faces the consequences of their action, when a child wins not with fists but with resilience, everyone understands that justice is not just an abstract concept, but something that can be implemented in this life. As the trial reached its most intense moment, Nyah stood up, her hands trembling, but not from fear, but from determination. Under the bright lights, that small girl stood like a torch in the middle of an otherwise dark room. Each step she took was certain, no longer the hesitation of a child afraid of power. Nyah walked toward the witness stand, her eyes never leaving the crowd watching her, but that gaze held no more apprehension, only an unusual confidence. The courtroom was silent, waiting for her words, unaware that Nyah's statement would change everything. The girl stood firm, looked toward the judge, and softly said, "I just want to be respected." Her words were not just those of an oppressed child, but a declaration of war against a system that had treated her as nothing more than a tool for entertainment, an object without value. There were no strong words, no loud slogans, just a simple yet profoundly deep statement. Nyah didn't need to do anything more. She didn't need to raise her hand or shout. Her words alone silenced the entire room. No one could have expected that. With a short sentence, she would turn the tide. The applause began to erupt, not from one corner of the room, but from all over, as a tribute to this brave girl. Public opinion outside started to boil over immediately. Comments flooded social media, all praising Nyah's courage. A little girl who dared speak the truth. Justice began with the words of a child, were the constant praises. People looked at Nyah not only with sympathy but with deep respect. It was Nyah, with her small yet powerful word, who awakened millions of hearts, making them realize that respect is not something that can be taken easily, and sometimes, justice doesn't require physical strength, but just a voice strong enough to overthrow all prejudices. Those watching from afar, through phones and computers, couldn't stop admiring her. The wave of reactions on social platforms surged rapidly, with millions sharing the video of Nyah speaking those words. The comments and shares didn't just praise Nyah, but sparked a broader discussion about fairness and human rights. People began asking, how have we treated children? And, are we truly respecting their rights in all circumstances? From what seemed like a simple case, Nyah made everyone reevaluate how society functions, especially towards the vulnerable and the children without a voice. The world began to change from that single statement. Not only in the courtroom, but out there, where millions were watching, everyone understood that it is the most vulnerable who stand the strongest when they are no longer afraid of injustice. And Nyah, though small, proved that an individual, no matter who they are, when standing for the truth, can not only change their own fate, but create a powerful wave strong enough to shake everything. Justice, fairness, and respect became values that could not be bent, and Nyah became the pioneer in this fight. The applause was not just for Nyah, but a tribute to all those who have ever stood up for the truth, whether in the shadows or in the light. Those who stayed in the courtroom, those outside watching through screens, all understood that respect and justice are the rights of every human being, regardless of age or status. And on that night, Nyah wrote a new chapter for herself, for those who dare to stand up, and for the world, showing that as long as there is enough courage to speak up, justice will always prevail. After the verdict was announced, the shockwaves from the trial spread everywhere. The officers who had blatantly given orders and cheered as Nyah was forced into the ring were found guilty of abuse of power, stripped of their positions amid public outrage. Images of them leaving the courtroom with heads down and badges removed from their chests appeared on the front pages of every newspaper, becoming symbols of arrogance brought low. The people of Jamaica could not hide their turmoil. Some breathed a sigh of relief that justice had finally spoken, while others wept bitterness at the truth that those sworn to protect had been the ones to trample dignity. From Kingston to London, from narrow streets to university halls, the story of Nyah and the sentencing of the police was echoed as a wake-up call. Schools held forums to discuss fairness. Politicians seized the moment to push for reform, and everywhere, the phrase, "respect for humanity," began appearing across city walls. Society was shaken not just by a scandal, but by the revelation that a system once considered a wall of protection had exposed critical flaws. people questioned, doubted, and demanded sweeping reform. Independent commissions were formed, and a wave of new investigations began, delving deep into the operations of the police force. Public discourse suggested that without Nyah, the truth might have remained buried forever. Her story stood as proof that even a small individual could spark massive change, and that very power forced those in control to face their responsibilities. While society continued to tremble, Valerie had to confront her own turning point. The once proud fighter who believed herself invincible no longer had a place in the professional ring. After her public apology to Nyah, she realized the old spotlight could never return, and she could no longer fight as before. Every time she stepped onto the mat, people would not see her with admiration, but with a gaze that reminded her of a humiliating past. So Valerie chose to retire. There was no grand press conference, no media frenzy. She quietly left the ring, leaving behind only one short message on her personal page. "I've lost many things, but I want to start again with the truth." In the beginning, Valerie lived quietly in a small apartment, away from the public eye. But gradually, she found a new path. A rundown gym on the outskirts of Kingston invited her to help train children. At first, she hesitated, but when she saw the innocent faces and the way their eyes lit up when touching boxing gloves for the first time, she realized she still had something to give. She began training them, not to win at all costs, but to teach them how to defend themselves, how to stand tall, and believe in who they were. In the cramped room with a worn wooden floor, Valerie no longer shouted or acted superior. Instead, she gently corrected each movement, patiently repeated basic drills, and more importantly, shared with them the lessons from her own life. The poor children, lacking both resources and encouragement, now had an unusual mentor. They listened as Valerie said, "Real strength isn't for humiliating others, it's for making sure you don't get knocked down." Coming from someone who had once gone astray, her words struck even deeper. Day by day, the little gym became a place of hope, where small hands learned to grip gloves tightly and weak legs practiced stepping with purpose. Valerie found her redemption there, in their eager eyes, in the laughter when they dodged a fake punch, in the sweat that fell not from failure, but from effort. Outside, the world remained restless, but in that quiet corner, another story was being written. People began to notice Valerie in a different way, no longer referencing her past fall, but seeing her as a devoted mentor. Some newspapers published images of her surrounded by children in the cramped space, her once proud eyes now replaced with a gentle smile. One comment read that true redemption isn't about word, but about choosing to spend the rest of your life giving back. And that's what allowed Valerie to be seen anew, not through the lens of past glory, but through the sincerity of her present. The police lost their badges, the system reformed, and Valerie left the ring to rebuild trust in the next generation. That story closed a chaotic chapter, but opened a new journey, one where people are forced to change to live up to the noble spirit of justice. For Nyah, the outcome wasn't just a personal victory, proof that standing up could shake an entire system. For Valerie, it was a final chance to show that even those once arrogant and misguided could choose a different path and plant kindness where darkness once lived. And for society, it was a reminder that justice will always find its way back, as long as someone has the courage to speak first. The news of Nyah receiving an international boxing scholarship spread like a strong gust of wind, igniting excitement across the community and beyond Jamaica's borders. A prestigious academy in London announced that, after reviewing Nyah's entire journey, from a victim of humiliation to a symbol of dignity, they had decided to offer her the chance to train in a professional environment, learn from top coaches, and compete in high-level youth tournaments. It was not just recognition of her physical ability, but a testament to her unwavering will. Major newspapers ran headlines like, "From Mockery to Pride," and "Jamaican Girl Welcomed by the World," making Nyah a name on everyone's lips. For her, the scholarship wasn't just a door to a broader future, but a chance to prove that pride can bloom even from trampled ground. On the day she received the official letter, Nyah stood still before the envelope bearing a red seal, her hand trembling as she touched each word. Before her lay an entirely new journey, but within her surged old memories. The mocking laughter, the painful blows, the blood on her lip, all came rushing back. Yet unlike before, they no longer frightened her, but became fuel to walk forward with steadier steps. Her mother held her close, eyes brimming with tears, while Jerome stood quietly in the corner, his aged eyes glowing with pride. He didn't say much, only nodded gently, as if to say she was on the right path. Before her departure, a small gathering was held at the familiar training ground where Jerome had taught her first punches. Neighbors from the block gathered, children chattered excitedly. Everyone wanted to witness the moment the once little girl was now set to represent them on the world stage. The air was warm, filled with chatter and emotion. In that moment, Jerome stepped into the circle, holding an old, worn wooden box faded by time. He opened the lid, revealing a pair of darkened gloves, the stitches frayed from years of use. These were the gloves that had followed him through countless matches, through triumph and defeat alike. Jerome raised them with both hands and placed them gently into Nyah's palm. His hoarse voice rang out, slow but steady. These are not just gloves. They carry the story of the past, the sweat, the blood, and the pride I once held. I'm giving them to you now, not to carry my glory, but to remember that when you wear them, you carry the dreams and trust of those who came before. Boxing isn't about knocking others down. It's about protecting yourself and protecting the truth. The crowd around them fell silent. Only the sound of wind through the old trees and the soft, nervous breaths of the girl holding the keepsake remained. Nyah held the gloves tightly to her chest, feeling the warmth radiating from the worn leather soaked in years of sweat. She bowed her head, her voice choked but firm. I promise I'll never let them be stained by cowardice. I'll wear them to prove that a child from Kingston can stand tall in the world. Applause broke out, intense and heartfelt, with many unable to hold back their tears. In that moment, no one saw Nyah as just a little girl anymore, but as a warrior carrying the legacy of an entire community. The farewell turned into a small celebration. Neighbors brought sweets, wildflowers, and handkerchiefs hastily embroidered with the words, "Go and return with pride." The children who had once trained alongside Nyah ran around, calling her name, cheering as if for a real match. Amid the cheers, Jerome stepped back, silently smiling. He knew that this moment was a passing of the torch, when the old gloves no longer belonged to someone fading into the past, but to a new generation reaching forward. On the flight out of Jamaica, Nyah sat by the window, looking down at the deep green land below. In her backpack, the old gloves were carefully placed, a reminder that this journey wasn't hers alone. She thought of Valerie, now guiding kids in the old gym, of Marcus, still fighting tirelessly for justice, of her mother watching with proud eyes. All of it came together as strength, making her heart race. She wasn't just carrying a dream of becoming an athlete. She carried the belief that pride knows no age, skin color, or background. Far away, coaches and training partners awaited her. New matches awaited, but Nyah knew those old gloves would always be the most valuable thing she had. They didn't give her the power to defeat opponents, but reminded her that every time she stepped into the ring, she must fight with courage and with respect for herself. And in that way, every step she took wasn't just a personal journey, but the journey of a generation that believed justice could begin with a small voice and grow into a force that changes the world. A year had passed since the historic trial ended, and the world had changed for Nyah. The Jamaican girl who had once been dragged across the ring in humiliation now returned, not as a victim, but as an official athlete. On the international sports stage, the nameplate read clearly, Nyah Campbell, Jamaica. That arena was packed, tens of thousands cheering not out of curiosity or for spectacle, but to witness the growth of a symbol. Nyah emerged from the waiting room, her steps steady, red gloves clenched tight, eyes lit like the spotlight above. In her heart, all the memories came rushing back, but they were no longer shadows. They were fire, fueling each powerful step forward. In the stands, hundreds of small flags waved, with the Jamaican flag standing out among banners that read, "Respect for Nyah." But most striking of all, in the front row sat Valerie, no longer the arrogant figure from the past, but a quiet companion. She wore a simple outfit, her hair tied back, her eyes locked onto Nyah's every movement. When the girl looked up to greet the crowd, Valerie jumped to her feet, clapping nonstop, her voice hoarse as she shouted, "Go, Nyah!" In that moment, the crowd around her joined in, the cheers rising like a wave of fire. The bell rang, and the match began. Nyah entered the ring with the mindset of a true athlete. Her first punch, though not the strongest, carried the precision and discipline forged over a year of training. Every step, every breath radiated determination. The audience wasn't just watching to see who would win. They were witnessing the journey of a girl who had once stood in the middle of a storm, now writing her own story. In the roar of the crowd, Valerie clenched her fists, her smile breaking through tears, knowing she was watching her own redemption unfold through Nyah's success. At another corner of the stands, Jerome Cole sat quietly, his familiar wooden cane by his side. His eyes gleamed with pride, knowing the old gloves he had passed down now graced Nyah's hands, tying past to present. He knew the journey was just beginning, but the moment she stepped into the ring as an official athlete had already proven everything. It was not just a victory for the girl, but for the millions who had once been forced, silenced, or belittled belittled, for it showed that human dignity cannot be buried. The match ended with the final bell, and Nyah stood tall, her breath quick, but her eyes shining. The audience rose to their feet, thunderous applause erupting as if to tear the roof off the arena. No one remembered the night of humiliation. All they saw was a young athlete, full of poise and confidence. Valerie left her seat, pushed through the crowd, and reached the edge of the ring, her hands covering her face as she burst into tears. But her mouth still smiled as she shouted, "You did it!" Nyah looked down, her gaze meeting the woman who had once caused her pain, and she smiled. A nod of forgiveness turned that moment into a symbol of redemption and rebirth. The next day, newspapers everywhere, from sports sections to social columns, ran headlines with a shared title, From Spectacle to Symbol, Nyah Campbell rewrites history. Her story was no longer confined to a scandal. It had become a spark of inspiration. People recounted the moment Valerie applauded, and Nyah's quiet nod, seeing it as proof that hatred can dissolve and justice can clear the way for empathy. 1 year later, the wounds they both carried had transformed into strength. Nyah had a long journey ahead. Valerie had found meaning in guiding the next generation, and Jerome smiled with contentment, knowing that the legacy he left wasn't old medals, but a spirit passed on to a girl who dared to stand tall. And in the eyes of millions watching, they saw that the story didn't end with a match. It began with a message. When justice and pride unite, even a child once humiliated can become a source of global inspiration. After the referee announced the results, no one remained seated. The roar exploded. Tens of thousands rose at once, clapping endlessly. Banners lifted into the air, voices screamed until hoarse, and the arena seemed to burst as chants echoed and waved. Nyah Campbell, Jamaica's pride! The chant spread everywhere, surging like the tide, crashing through the rafters and rolling across the ring, making Nyah's small feet tremble, not from fear, but from the sheer power of recognition. Cameras swept across the crowd, capturing every beaming face, even the tears streaming down the face of her mother, who covered her mouth in pride. And in that very moment, Nyah knew the path she had walked. From the night she was forced into the ring to this second, was now etched into the hearts of not just herself, but her entire nation. That sound didn't stop inside the arena, it was broadcast live to the world. In Jamaica, people poured into the streets, dancing and singing, treating the victory like a national celebration. In faraway places, from New York to London, crowds gathered in cafes and public squares, chanting her name. International news outlets instantly picked up the story, headlines blazing, Nyah Campbell, pride of Jamaica. A girl who once symbolized shame had now become an emblem of resilience, proving that no humiliation could ever extinguish human dignity. The image of Nyah raising her fist, eyes glowing under the lights, appeared on front pages and digital billboards everywhere, becoming the clearest portrait of rebirth. Valerie sat below, her palms red from clapping too long, tears mixing with laughter. She knew those cheers were also her release, because her presence there, as a supporter, was the final step in her journey to redemption. Jerome Cole, aged but sharp-eyed, rose with the help of his cane, stomping the wooden floor in rhythm with the crowd's chants, a quiet smile crossing his lips as he witnessed his old gloves usher in a new chapter. Marcus Hill, the young attorney, watched from afar with pride, knowing his work hadn't just defended a child, but had reignited hope for millions fighting injustice. The chants of Nyah's name went on, as if everyone wanted to carve her image into history. At that moment, the arena no longer held divisions between audience, athlete, or former adversary. It became one body beating to a single rhythm, honoring the strength of pride and courage. On Nyah's face, her radiant smile wasn't that of someone who had just won a match, but of someone who had reclaimed her worth. She lifted a hand to her lips, then raised it high as a gesture of thanks to all. And that simple gesture was answered by even louder, thunderous applause. The final message of this story wasn't about punches or match results, but about a child who was once forced, once trampled, and chose to rise. Justice didn't arrive in cold verdicts. It began in a small moment when Nyah dared to say, "I'm not a joke." That moment sparked a journey that exposed arrogance, unmasked abuse of power, and opened a new path for hope. From one humiliating fall, Nyah turned it into a force to deliver a message to the world. Respect is a basic right, and human dignity is untouchable. As the chant, Nyah Campbell, pride of Jamaica, echoed through the air, everyone understood that this story was no longer just about a girl or a match. It had become a symbol. It served as a reminder that justice can begin with the smallest thing, with a lifted gaze, a simple statement, yet its power can shake entire systems and ignite hope for a whole generation. And in that overwhelming moment, the world realized that sometimes a single step on the ring can open a much larger path for humanity. Nyah Campbell's story began from what seemed like a hopeless moment, when she was shoved into a ring under the gaze of thousands. That night, she was just a small girl turned into a spectacle, crushed under the weight of adult arrogance and power, which seemed strong enough to destroy everything. Yet from that darkest moment, flame rose, helping her turn fear into strength, humiliation into an opportunity to prove that human dignity cannot be buried. Each time she stood tall, each blazing look became part of a chain reaction no one could have foreseen. On that journey, Nyah was not alone. Jerome Cole, the aging legend who had quietly stepped away from the spotlight, re-emerged as a guardian, passing on to her his resilience and the gloves worn through years of grueling fights. His mentorship taught her not only how to defend herself, but how true strength comes from keeping one's soul upright. Even Valerie, the one who once caused her pain, eventually bowed her head, realizing that she too had been made into a tool, and bravely chose to stand beside Nyah in pursuit of justice. These encounters turned the story into more than just one child's struggle. It became a journey of people willing to face their faults and change. The fateful trial marked a turning point as the truth was laid bare before the world. The abusers were held accountable, the lies were exposed, and society shook under the voice of a girl who only asked to be respected. Nyah's image standing in court, speaking that simple yet powerful sentence, brought tears to millions. It was not just the voice of one person, but the echo of countless others who had been silenced. From then on, justice no longer felt like a distant concept, but something real, found in the courage of a child who dared to speak up. The aftermath brought deep changes. Officers lost their badges, systems of power were forced to reform, and Valerie left the ring to find purpose in training underprivileged children. These actions showed that the collapse of arrogance can open the way to redemption. Nyah, awarded an international scholarship, brought Jerome's worn gloves to a grander stage. Every step she took was not only for herself, but for all the children who needed a figure to believe they could stand tall in the face of adversity. 1 year later, Nyah returned to the ring, this time as a true athlete. Tens of thousands of spectators chanted her name in unison. The pride of Jamaica, Valerie sat below the stands, her tears blending into the roar of the crowd, while Jerome smiled in quiet satisfaction. That moment was not just a sporting victory, but a declaration, from a moment of humiliation. A person can rise and rewrite their own history. From a child once forced into the ring, Nyah had become a symbol of pride, resilience, and the power of belief. The lasting lesson from this story is that justice can begin with something small, with a lifted gaze, with a seemingly simple sentence, but if it holds truth, it can shake an entire system. It shows us that power, no matter how well disguised in layers of grandeur, will tremble when someone dares to rise. More importantly, it reminds us that forgiveness and solidarity are the paths that can lead everyone out of the darkness. Nyah Campbell proved that respect is not a gift to be granted, but a natural human right, and when we dare to claim it, we not only save ourselves but plant seeds of hope for an entire generation.